Although it's impossible to condense an ice spear or create a blizzard like that of the Demoness pathway to inflict a direct attack, I can freeze the surrounding ground, lower the temperature of the air, and effectively affect the movement of my enemy. If there's any physical contact, then I can even freeze the enemy's body or stiffen his flesh and blood. It's a perfect match for my combat ability. The third is the manipulation of zombies. Haha, I no longer need to be afraid of not being able to have partners for a round of cards. Klein thought for a moment, then he bent down to inspect the items on Steel Mavati's person. He quickly found 26 pounds, 11 soldi, and 8 pence in cash, as well as a collection of strange things that seemed normal, such as candles, clips, a thorny whip and so on. Considering the fact that Steel Mavati was a member of the Rose School of Thought and belonged to the type of people who indulged in their desires, Klein vaguely understood what was going on. Spitting on the ground, he only took the cash. Werewolf has supernatural healing powers. Zombie has a body like steel. There's really no need for him to carry any healing-related medicine or items. It's as Danitz concluded, Mavati doesn't have any mystical items. That's right, mystical items are few in number to begin with. Many have clear flaws and negative effects. Not everyone can have one even if they want one. Previously, in the group consisting of a wraith, zombie, and werewolf, there were only 2 mystical items: Scarlet Lunar Corona and Biological Poison Bottle. Klein nodded and took out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded the yellowed piece of paper and placed it on the body of Steel Mavati, covering his face. It was a bounty notice with a portrait of Mavati and the corresponding bounty reward, 6,000 pounds. Klein straightened up, took a step back, stepped on the peacock blue carpet, and pulled out a paper figurine. Pa! With a swing of his arm, his wrist shook, and the paper figurine was thrown out. It burst into flames before scattering into ashes. Soon after, he phased into a shadow and disappeared into the alley along with the items. 2 or 3 minutes later, Cordoba Roy rushed over with a portion of the mandated Punisher team, just in time to see a cool breeze blow up the bounty notice, revealing Steel Mavati's dissolving flesh and blood dissolving, his eyes wide open. Whoosh! The bounty notice fell to the side and remained facing up. Having lost track of their target, Cordoba and the others silently brought Steel's corpse back to the area where the battle had taken place. Glancing at the team members who were inspecting the site, the deacon, Cordoba, restrained his emotions and asked in a deep voice, "A believer of the sun?" This was the most important question for him and his diocese. The mandated Punisher team member responsible for finding clues via supernatural means to recreate the truth wasn't a Beyonder of the Storm pathway, but a Sequence 7 knowledge keeper corresponding to Reader, also known as Detective. He didn't rush to answer, but instead came over and squatted down to examine Mavati's corpse. After a while he looked up and said, "It's not a believer of the sun, probably a result of using the powers of a mystical item." "Reason?" Cordoba asked with a frown. The mandated Punisher said, "There's an evil feeling within that stems from flesh and blood. One of the corpses was devoured in such a manner, leaving only a body's traits and items. If it's a sun believer, they wouldn't do something like that even if they relied on items. To them, things in the domain of the true creator are sacrilegious and require immediate purification or sealing. They likely wouldn't borrow its powers." After thinking for a few seconds, Cordoba agreed with this conclusion and asked, "Someone from the Aurora Order?" "No, a real Rose Bishop or Shepherd wouldn't act so crudely. They'll definitely wrap the corpse within their body and deal with the scene after departing. There's no reason to dismember the body on the spot. It's a waste of time that also leaves a bunch of items that can be considered valuable. To devour him in such a rush, it resembles that of the negative effects of a mystical item," the knowledge keeper said calmly. "A mystical item that possesses powers in both the sun and secret suppliant domains? Perhaps it's something with powers like that of a shepherd? Berg, what's your take?" As a deacon, Cordoba had the clearance to know of a shepherd and their special abilities. As for the knowledge keeper knowing, it was a result of his position in the team. The other mandated Punishers had no idea what they were talking about. Knowledge keeper Berg stood up. "It's all possible. Any suspects?" Cordoba asked in a low voice. Berg shook his head. "There are no suspects for the time being. But one thing can be confirmed. Blood Brambles was killed by blazing Danitz. The other person is his helper. A rather terrifying powerhouse that's not weaker than a pirate admiral." A terrifying powerhouse. Cordoba's expression turned grave as he muttered under his breath. Following that, his eyes lit up. "Could it be Edwina?" She can simulate some Beyonder powers which she has seen before. Knowledge Keeper Berg pondered for a moment and then said, "We can't rule out that possibility, but our intelligence shows that she was in the vicinity of Sonia Island a few days ago. Unless she can simulate a corresponding ability and use the spirit world to travel here." Cordoba paced back and forth, looked around, and said, "Deal with the scene, and don't bring this to the attention of the nearby residents. I'll submit the mission report, and let's hope that we'll receive more effective information." This involved a powerhouse whose combat prowess was equivalent to at least a Sequence 5. He could only restrain his irascible mood and make the most rational decision. Inside Old Quinn's house, in the basement with the heavy stone door sealed shut, Alger was sitting on the low bed, quietly looking at the candles on the table when his vision blurred. He saw the gray fog emanate, along with the fool sitting on a high chair, overlooking everything. A blurry silhouette appeared below, hands clasped before his face as he said in a pious tone, "Honorable Mr. Fool, the matter has come to a successful conclusion." The matter has come to a successful conclusion? This involves Steel Mavati and several other Beyonders. The world sure is efficient at handling matters. His strength is stronger than I expected. As expected of an adorer of Mr. Fool. Heh, he might be able to sell another Beyonder characteristic at the Tarot Club, maybe even more than one. How did he get around the effects of sealed artifact 2-37? The uniqueness of a god's adorer? A thought flashed through Alger's mind, and he instinctively thanked Mr. Fool. Then, he took out a small metal bottle and smeared mint extract on the tip of his nose. A strong, irritating odor seeped into his head, instantly making Alger become abnormally clear-headed. At some point in time, a white gauze mask appeared in his hands, and he had poured the full moon essence oil onto it. After methodically putting on his mask, Alger stood up and walked slowly to the heavy stone door. With a staid series of movements, he retrieved a sealed metal jar from the inside of his clothes, twisted the mechanical switch, and pulled out a tube. Then, he stuffed the tube into the crevice of the stone door and extended it out. Without a sound, the gas inside the metal container started to emanate. This was the sanguine anesthetic gas provided by the moon, Emlyn. It can knock out strong commoners, Sequence 9 Beyonders with strong bodies, and even higher sequences who were lacking in their constitution. Even if Old Quinn can resist the gas, he would still be significantly affected. As for his helpers and friends, Alger leaned against the stone door and waited patiently. When nearly a third of the gas was dispersed from the jar, he pulled the tube back and closed the switch. He turned around and listened attentively before receiving a satisfactory answer. Alger revealed a faint smile. He rapidly converged his aura and compressed it inside him. Suddenly, the muscles on his body bulged, and he threw a punch forward. Raging blow. Bang! The iron lock of the heavy stone door directly shattered, and the door itself opened up. Alger withdrew his fist and walked out, leaving only the sleeping figures outside. Author's note: Creeping Hunger has two modes, grazing and devouring. The former targets the soul and Beyonder characteristic, while the latter targets the flesh and blood. Chapter 529. Tacitness 48 Acid Lemon Street, outside the Wind of Azure Inn. Dressed in a thick jacket and pantaloons, Blazing Danitz returned by taking a detour. He clung to the corner of a wall, remaining motionless for a long time. He was hesitating on whether to take the opportunity to run away and not face the terrifying madman, Gehrman Sparrow, again. Unlike the battle at Bansi Harbor, he was hiding on a rooftop far away this time. It allowed him to take in the entire battle zone. Therefore, while supporting Gehrman Sparrow and battling Blood Brambles Hendry, he finally saw the combat process of the crazy adventurer, finally grasping his Beyonder powers and traits. Paper figurine substitutes, phasing out from flames, psychic blasts, a holy beam from the sun domain, shooting out air bullets with his finger, the ability to disguise himself into another person, as well as a glove that changes its appearance several times and devoured squall. His powers far exceed my imagination, and there are a few that can't be compatible with each other. This isn't something that can be explained simply with the addition of one or two miraculous items to a sequence. Also, the sense of hunger that came from the depths of his soul explains something. That glove from the Vice Admiral Hurricane, Creeping Hunger. Captain had specifically reminded us that the glove can use the souls of many Beyonders for grazing and thus use their powers. Danitz went through the thoughts he previously had and came to a final judgment. Gehrman Sparrow is the current owner of Creeping Hunger. He didn't feel any sense of belittlement simply because Gehrman had relied on a powerful mystical item to display such terrifying strength. Instead, he felt even more reverence for him. The reason for this was just one. A large part of using a mystical item to its fullest had to do with one's abilities. Without sufficient strength and extraordinary combat experience, even with creeping hunger, Gehrman Sparrow wouldn't have been able to finish off Steel Mavati and Calm Squall within 10 seconds. 2. His captain, Vice Admiral Edwina Edwards, learned from secret sources that Vice Admiral Hurricane didn't die at the hands of the Church of Storms, but instead, he was quickly killed by a particular powerhouse while fleeing. Danitz had no lack of understanding regarding the power of Vice Admiral Hurricane, Kalangos, back when he was at his peak. He knew that the standing of a powerhouse which could easily finish him off was equal to that of the top pirate powers. Furthermore, it would be two of the most powerful and terrifying ones, the King of the Five Seas and Queen Mystic. Although there's the factor of surprise, it would just lower the evaluation by a little. The person wouldn't be much weaker than the King of Immortality, and they'll be stronger than Admiral Hell and Admiral of Blood. Creeping hunger now belongs to Gehrman Sparrow. This means that he's either the one who killed Kalangos, or there's a power figure at the level of the Four Kings backing him up. No matter which possibility it is, it's all the more terrifying than I had originally expected. Danitz's body tensed up. He really didn't want to face the adventurer who had crazy blood flowing in him. Phew! He heaved a sigh of relief. He felt that he had been hesitating here for too long, and that he had to make a decision as soon as possible. Gehrman Sparrow knows how to divine, and he's rather confident in his abilities in this domain. With my shadow cloak in his hands, escaping won't only fail, but it would also end up infuriating him. Shadow cloak is a rare mystical item. Clenching his teeth, Danitz turned the corner and went through the door of the hotel, all the way to the luxurious suite. After a few seconds of careful waiting and observation, Danitz took out his key and opened the door. He saw that the room was dark, that the gas wall lights hadn't been lit, and that the not very bright light of the early morning was shining through the window and onto Gehrman Sparrow, who was facing the door. The adventurer had changed back into his usual tweed black overcoat with dark trousers. He held a half-top hat in his hand, and his right foot was raised over his left thigh. He leaned back a little, his face obscured since his back was to the window. Only his dark brown eyes, which were exceptionally clear, watched the door with indifference and calmness. Danitz unconsciously lowered his head, laughed dryly and said, "In accordance with your instructions, I circled to a few news agencies and wrote the information that Blazing had killed Steel Mavati, Blood Brambles Hendry, and Squall on pieces of paper and threw them in. Of course, I mentioned having a powerful helper in this piece of news. He's a mysterious, unknown, a top adventurer, and a veteran bounty hunter." Klein nodded, revealing a polite smile. "Very good." With a sigh of relief, Danitz looked around and saw the peacock blue carpet. He was stunned for a few seconds before asking in puzzlement, "What about the heads of Steele and Hendry?" Klein replied calmly, "Wasn't taken." "You didn't take them?" Danitz exclaimed in astonishment. "Then what about our bounty?" As long as they had the heads of Steele and Blood Brambles, he would be able to get the appropriate bounty through people with connections. Although this would cost them 15 to 30% of the money received, he couldn't claim the bounty himself as a pirate. This was the only way, as the military's and the church's use of bounty rewards to encourage pirates to kill each other didn't mean that they would turn a blind eye to a gift that came walking through the door. To Danitz's surprise, Gehrman Sparrow, whose eyes were crazed with a desire for money, had actually not taken the heads of Steel and Blood Brambles, which meant that he had automatically given up on the bounty. Klein didn't answer him and pointed to the flying carpet on the ground. "You had helped in this. You have two choices. One is 3,000 pounds in cash, and the other is this flying carpet. You have 5 seconds to consider. Exceeding that time will be considered as forfeiting. 3,000 pounds in cash or the flying carpet. This flying carpet seems to only have the ability of suspension and flight. Furthermore, its speed isn't too fast, and it's not too useful. No, at sea, to a beyonder not from the sailor pathway, such items are very precious. At the very least, there's no need to worry about the aftermath of a ship being sunk." Danitz was momentarily thrown into a dilemma. Then he heard Gehrman Sparrow's voice counting. 3, 2. Danitz's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly said, "Flying carpet." Klein nodded and said, "Okay." With the knowledge that Gehrman had great credibility, Danitz finally relaxed before asking with a grumbling mumble, "Why didn't you count 5 and 4? Wasn't it supposed to be 5 seconds?" Klein replied without changing his expression. Counted inwardly. Counted inwardly. Danitz took a deep breath and grimaced. Klein slowly stood up, flicked his wrist, threw the hat from his hand, and left it hanging firmly on the rack before walking to his bedroom. Cathedral of Waves. Alger, who entered in the name of coming for morning prayers, met the diocese bishop, Chogo, and explained everything that had happened last night. The only thing that had been modified was that the sanguine anesthesia gas had been turned into a slumber charm of the Church of Evernight. Chogo nodded in approval. To be able to go deep into the enemy's lair and bear the risk of death for the sake of your faith, such an act is worthy of praise. You are a true storm attendant. Last night, we captured 5 Beyonders and killed 2 of them on the spot. As a result of this, Mavedi, Hendry, and Squall have also died. The heads of these 3 pirates will no longer appear, or they will be in our hands, so the government's bounty will be ours. The total receivable reward will exceed more than £10,000 in total, and you will receive the bulk of it, which is £6,000. Do not refuse. The Lord has told us that those who fight for their faith must not be reserved. Holy Lord of Storms. An excited Alger pounded his left chest with his fist. Although he and the world didn't agree on how to split the spoils of war, he believed that the 2 of them had come to a tacit understanding. For example, they were not to interfere with each other when hunting pirates. As the bounty needed to be laundered through the church, the 2 of them would split it equally. As for the bounty offered by countries and organizations such as Intis and Fay-Sac, Alger didn't hold any expectations for them. This was because every time one exchanged for the bounty reward, one needed to hand over the corpse or head of the target. Therefore, only one entity could be chosen. Only those with a deep background and good relations with the various organizations and countries could receive all of them. £3,000 will belong to the world. If I were to lose £3,000 at once, it will raise suspicion. Yes, I'll have to find an opportunity to buy a mystical item. Such things are rare, so they're often overpriced, even more so when in times of great need. No one will doubt that I spent £5,000 on a purchase that's worth £3,000. If I sell the items obtained from Old Quinn, the ones he had received, the accounts would be squared. Alger quickly came up with a follow-up solution. Knowing that he had £3,000 waiting for him, Klein sat happily in the high-back chair of the fool and considered a serious question. That is, after grazing Steel Mavedi, he had to release a soul from creeping hunger as he promised. Their Beyonder powers are quite useful. It's quite a pity to release them before finding a replacement. Yes. Besides, I've already released that Faceless. There doesn't seem to be a need to do it this time. Feelings of hesitation and reluctance to part had stirred in Klein's heart as he was thrown into a dilemma. He was unable to make a decision. After a long time, he leaned back and exhaled. I can't deceive myself. He shook his head and laughed, turning relaxed from making up his mind. He decided to keep his promise and release a soul. The Faceless from before had been released early because he wanted to receive some corresponding information. It was already an equal exchange. Which one should I release? Miss Justice bought the materials for a psychiatrist potion and a mystical item worth 5,500. Even if she's rich, her financial situation should be tight, so it wouldn't be appropriate to sell the psychiatrist characteristic at this time. Yes, she still owes my adorer £2,000 and will repay the money in February or March. Klein rejected the idea and decided to release the Nightmare. As a former Nighthawk, he always had an inclination and felt gratitude based on his impression and feelings towards Beyonders in this domain. Therefore, it wasn't difficult to make a choice in these situations without having any other factors to consider. Calming himself down, Klein picked up the human-skinned glove that he had previously brought above the grey fog. He closed his eyes and began to sense the distorted souls. Without any hesitation, he released the Nightmare. Chapter 530. Chronicles. The Nightmare appeared by the side of the long bronze table. He was a man in his 30s with black hair and blue eyes, a long, thin face, and obvious nasolabial folds. He had a beard that wasn't too thick by his mouth and chin. As the pain and the distortion eased, he pressed his hand to his chest and gave a solemn bow. Compared to the Faceless from before, the Nightmare was obviously not as muddle-headed and weak after being released. It was unknown if the Evernight pathway's enhancement to one's soul was stronger than that of the Seer pathway, or if it was because the grazing process had only happened recently. Klein sighed silently and began asking via spirit channeling, "Why did you die at the hands of Kalangos?" The corner of the Nightmare's mouth slightly curled up, revealing a bitter smile. I'm a red glove from the Nighthawks. I was tracking down a bunch of ancient chronicles that originated from a Bayam imperial tomb. We suspected that they were related to the reason for Death's passing. I found out that a part of it might have fallen into the hands of a particular tycoon, so I led 2 companions of mine and boarded the ship he was on. Unfortunately, we were attacked by Kalangos's fleet just as we were about to launch an investigation. What happened to your companions? Klein subconsciously asked. The nightmare said in a slightly pained tone, we originally had the opportunity to leave and even kill Kalangos through our skillful teamwork, but our ship sank, and we had to board a lifeboat instead. Everyone died. No, they were killed in the line of duty. May the goddess bless you. Klein drew a crimson moon inwardly. This made him more aware of the great difference between fighting at sea and fighting on land. Environmental factors were of critical importance. Beyonders not from the sailor pathway would be at a great disadvantage. If it wasn't because of the fact that the flying carpet had been huge, cumbersome, and slow, making him an easy target, Klein would have opted to keep it and give Dan its cash. Fortunately, I have the bladder of a murloc. I can find an artisan to create a mystical item that allows me to swim underwater. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to find an artisan. Most of them are from the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery, and there aren't many unaffiliated ones. Otherwise, mystical items wouldn't be this rare. If push comes to shove, I'll get Mr. Hangman to help. Klein looked at the nightmare who had been killed in the line of duty and said softly as he leaned back. What's your name? What unfulfilled wishes do you have? The figure of the nightmare was already slowly dissipating. When he heard Klein's question, he said with a smile, My name is Davy Raymond. I lost my parents, wife, and siblings in a black magic incident, leaving me with only one daughter, Nilu. She was born in 1330 and is a very lovely girl. And I'm sorry to say that in order to investigate the truth over the black magic incident, I joined the Nighthawks and later became a red glove. I didn't manage to spend time with her, making her lose her father alongside her mother. Haha, I believe that the church will definitely give her my pension and secretly provide her a certain amount of help. I'm not worried about her life, but I only hope to see her enter the hall of marriage under the witness of the goddess, to have her own family and not be lonely anymore. It's already the year 1350. She may already have a marriage partner. Klein sighed wistfully and said, Time flies. Davy Raymond muttered in response. Tell her that all the culprits have been punished and that I died because of an accident. There's no need to hate anyone anymore. Tell her that Daddy loves her, and Daddy is very sorry. His figure became more and more transparent, and he was about to disappear. Klein closed his eyes and asked, Where does she live? What's the name of the tycoon who collected Death's Chronicles? We live in Desi County's Conant City. It's a beautiful seaside city, with rich rubber plantations growing nearby. If she hasn't moved, then she'll be living at 67 Red Indus Street. The tycoon's name is Jimmy Necker. He should have fallen into the hands of Kalangos as well. Before Davy Raymond finished speaking, his figure had already completely disappeared, leaving only a deep black gem-like object on the surface of his glove. Klein quietly watched this scene, and after a few seconds, he raised his right hand and tapped 4 times clockwise on his chest. He then said in a deep voice, If there's a chance, I will visit your daughter and see how she's doing. In the palace, which looked like a giant's residence, the fog was endless, without any undulations, and was eternally unchanging. Klein put away Davy Raymond's Beyonder characteristic, rubbed his forehead, and turned his attention back to Death's Chronicles. The Death Pathway and the Evernight Pathway can be switched at high sequences. There's nothing odd about the church sending personnel to investigate the corresponding chronicles. I wonder if Jimmy Necker is dead or not. I'll need to find out. If he has already perished in a tragic case, and the thing has fallen in Kalangos's hands, that will require me to investigate from the pirate side. Kalangos's crew now belongs to Vice Admiral Ailment, Tracy. As it involves death, it might be able to help Mr. Azek. Klein decided to check it out in passing himself, and if he encountered any difficulties, he could write directly to the powerhouse. After clearing his mind, he quickly returned to the real world and used the ritual to summon creeping hunger back. After everything was done and seeing that it was already getting late, he gave up on the idea of trying to catch up on his sleep. He decided to summarize the experiences and lessons from last night's operation. The biggest lesson for Klein was that he had overestimated the patience of the mandated punishers. He had originally hoped that, even if there had been an accident in the beginning, the mandated punishers would have been able to restrain him and wait for the real target, the real protagonist, Steel Mavati, to appear. When that happened, they would have definitely used the sealed artifact which can pull many people into a dream, restraining all the unaffiliated Beyonders who had involved themselves in the Blitz. As for me, due to my uniqueness, I would be able to detect that I'm asleep and be able to forcibly escape. Then, I could have dealt with Steel Mavati and his helpers in a composed manner, completing an achievement of an instant kill, and also bring 2 corpses along with me. Yet, just as the incident happened, that bunch of irascible brothers stormed in. They didn't even leave any backup teams to watch out for any contingencies. At the very most, they would let the wielder of the sealed artifact stay beyond the periphery, with 1 or 2 guards. The more Klein thought, the more he was at a loss on whether to laugh or cry. If it wasn't because Steel mandated Punisher's group of pirates who were more cautious and had at least 2 Beyonders assigned, as well as all their puppets and zombies to stop the mandated Punishers that might have pursued them, Klein would likely have found himself in a situation of going 2 against 5. If that had happened, he would have chosen to give up and directly engage in a strategic shift. What made Klein most satisfied was that he had done a pretty good job of making specific preparations. This was the professional habit of a magician. Because he had long known from Miss Sharon and Merrick about the traits of the first 5 sequences of the mutant pathway, Klein was well aware that Steel Mavati, who had gone through the lunatic phase, could use irrational factors to resist any Beyonder disruption and influence on his mind. He had very strong resistance in this aspect. Therefore, he gave up the thought of using Psychiatrist's Dragon Maiden Frenzy, as well as Nightmare, which was clearly weaker than the mandated Punisher sealed artifact, and he instead focused on the Interrogator's Psychic Piercing and the Priest of Light's Purification powers. Psychic Piercing wasn't a Beyonder power that disrupted one's thoughts and affected one's soul, but a means to directly attack the spirit body. In essence, the other effect acted on one's body of heart and mind, and targeted the soul body. There was a clear difference between the two. If any part of that combo failed to chain in any way, Steel Mavati would have been able to recover, making it impossible for me to kill him quickly. And in that environment, that would spell failure. Yes. I've also used the Pathway's trait of losing themselves to their desires, making it easy to grasp their emotions. I believe that once they suffered a psychic attack, there would be a high chance of them counterattacking in madness, without any consideration of anything else. In fact, the safest way of dealing with a zombie is to set up matchsticks or have danets. I'll use Flaming Jump and Light of Holiness, kiting Mavati. It'll make him want to battle but be completely unable to reach his opponent. He wouldn't escape even if he wanted to. Just send a fireball, and I'll catch up to him. Unfortunately, it's a waste of time, and the situation didn't allow for it. Klein sighed, took out his pocket watch, snapped it open, and checked the time. Seeing that it was almost 9 o'clock in the morning, he turned the handle of the door and walked out of the bedroom. At this moment, Danitz was lying in a reclining chair, producing snores that sounded like a steam engine was operating in the room. He was quite alert, opening his eyes and sitting up as soon as Klein came out. "Are you going out?" Danitz asked when he saw Gehrman Sparrow take off his hat from the coat rack. "Yes." Klein maintained his persona and didn't explain that he was attempting to act by helping someone confess. "What about me? Steel Mavati and his men are almost all dead, so I don't have to worry about that anymore. Even if the newspaper doesn't publish the news, I can spread it myself. There were idle pirates and adventurers who will use it as a material for bragging, spreading the matter to the sea and would end up informing Captain. That bunch of dogs hit can't do a thing aside from drink and brag, but even so they still have their uses." Danitz thought for a moment, then he asked while secretly feeling a sense of fear, "Mr. Sparrow, can I leave now?" Klein revealed a faint smile. "You have always been free." "That's right. I wasn't caught by him this time. I was just looking for help. I have always been free." Danitz was stunned for a moment. Then he was delighted. But right at that moment, he heard Gehrman Sparrow's voice lightly fleeting towards him. "But that ends now." What?" Danitz looked confused. It took him no less than 3 seconds to understand what Gehrman Sparrow meant. He had been captured again. "Why?" Danitz asked angrily and aggrieved. Klein put on his hat and said in a low voice, "I want to meet your captain." Danitz widened his eyes, stood up abruptly, and shouted out, "What do you want?" "This fellow is a little too agitated." Klein replied calmly, "I have some things to ask her." Chapter 531. Great acting. He has some things to ask Captain? Danitz frowned as he watched Gehrman Sparrow leave the room, unsure what his real motive was. What is this fellow really after? Money, riches? But he had the time to take away the heads of Steel Mavady and Blood Brambles Hendry to exchange for nearly £10,000 in bounty rewards. Yes, even after paying any commissions, it would still be £7,000 to £8,000. Yet he didn't do so. Moreover, he generously shared the spoils of war with me. This is very contradictory. When he first heard that I was blazing, his first reaction was to call me a £3,000 bounty. In Captain's words, this isn't scientific. Why would he deliberately give up the bounty? Unless he has a better way to claim it safely, or he had specially left it for someone. Yes. He had been prepared for the appearance of the mandated punishers. He has his own connections and information channels. This way everything can be explained. There's also the possible existence of the demigod that killed Kalangos. There's a powerful and secretive organization behind Gehrman Sparrow. Shocked by his own conjecture, Danitz instinctively tried to use his body language to express his feelings, but he forgot that his left arm was still fractured. He immediately grimaced in pain. This made him feel even more terrified. He didn't want his captain to meet such a dangerous and crazy fellow. He even suspected that Gehrman Sparrow's real motive was his captain's £26,000 bounty. In a duel, that lunatic might not necessarily win against Captain, and there's still the first mate, second mate, third mate, and a few bosuns. But he has a terrifying organization backing him. You want to hurt Captain? Over my dead body. Danitz puffed out his chest, raised his neck, and was filled with a stirring sense of self-sacrifice. He ran a hand through his hair, gave a long grunt and said to himself, I'll make further observations. Perhaps Gehrman Sparrow really only has questions that he wants answered. Subconsciously, he looked around and found both the flying carpet and the shadow cloak. They weren't missing. In other words, Gehrman Sparrow left the things that belong to me behind. Isn't he afraid that I'll take the opportunity to escape? Or did he steal my hair that makes it easy for divination? No, he's a crazy guy. Even if he wishes to use my hair, he would just walk over and extend his hand to pull one out. It's impossible for him to do it secretly. Right, there's a powerful and secretive organization behind him. Perhaps, at this moment, there are people from that organization secretly monitoring me. They're waiting for me to leave, waiting for me to seek out Captain. How insidious. Gehrman Sparrow must have gone out on purpose. Danitz felt that he had grasped the truth of the matter thanks to his experience and wisdom. He paced back and forth before sitting back in the reclining chair. He then thought with a silent, mocking smile. I'm not leaving. I want to see what you can do. I will not bring danger to Captain. 3:15 in the afternoon. Saimim Island. This island was also a part of the Rorstad archipelago, but it was the furthest from the city of generosity, Bayam. It took nearly 5 hours on a liner to reach it. On the way, Klein bought a suit with local characteristics and a small suitcase to replace the clothes he changed out of, for a total of 14 soli. They weren't even worth £1. It's really cheap. It's just change compared to a complete suit. Wearing pantaloons, a thick brown jacket, and a light brown cap, Klein disembarked from the liner with a native face that didn't stand out, and he entered some of the old ports on Saimim Island. He had spent time buying clothes and changing his appearance, causing him to miss the 9 o'clock ferry and be put in a situation where he could only take the ferry at 10. Thinking of the expenses he had to pay for this acting, he couldn't help but calculate his current financial situation. The faceless characteristic was sold for £3,825. The pirate bounties net me £3,000. Although I haven't received the £6,825, I can basically include it into my budget as long as Mr. Hangman doesn't get exposed. The leftover cash from Donna and Company's gratuity add up to £255 in bits and pieces. I found £26, 11 soli, and 8 pence from Steel Mavady's body. Yes, there's still the 5 gold coins as reserves. I haven't spent much money recently, only spending slightly more than £1 in total. This is something to be happy about. With that, I'll have £7,110. Moreover, I still have the Nightmare Beyonder characteristic and the Murloc's bladder. They're still worth something. On second thought, I earned a £3,000 bounty with a Zombie Beyonder characteristic. The latter is worth about £3,000 to £5,000. That is to say I earned about £7,000. This is only from Steel Mavady, Blood Brambles Hendry, and squall. Besides, there was quite a lot of waste. Indeed, hunting pirates is quite a good job. It can administer justice, punish the evil, protect the weak and innocent, and also make me rich overnight. Klein subconsciously turned his head to the side, only to see that the color of the seawater was much clearer than that of Bayam's. It was as if the seawater was a huge, green, sparkling gem, reflecting golden rays under the sunlight. Sure enough, it's not without reason that generations after generations of adventurers have gone out to sea to search for wealth. Even if I deduct the remnant spirituality of ancient wraiths, eyes from a six-winged gargoyle, spring water from Sonia Island's golden spring, and other supplementary ingredients of a nimble right master, the money I have left will be enough to allow me to buy a decent manor here, in Desi Bay, in the southern continent's colonies, and in the non-metropolitan areas. Lone's countryside is said to be very beautiful, and if it turns out that I'm really unable to return, I can consider settling down in a similar place. Yes, I still have a 10% stake in the Backland Bike Company, and my future returns won't be low. With confidence, Klein straightened his back and thought about the future. After letting his thoughts wander, Klein began to think about the more realistic question, which was whether he should sell the Nightmare Beyonder characteristic, find an opportunity to return it to the Church of Evernight, or create a mystical item with it through an artisan. It depends on the situation. The ideal solution would be to sell it to the church. The martyr Klein, who had taken 2 potions from the Nighthawks, thought with uncertainty. At the same time, he hoped that Little Sun would soon reach Sequence 7 and be qualified to gain clearance to the methods used to remove the mental corruption from a Beyonder characteristic. As for the matter of releasing the Priest of Light from the glove, he wasn't in a hurry. Little Sun had just received the potion formula for Sequence 7, so he had no need for it at the moment. He would have to wait for a long time, and the powers of a Priest of Light was very effective in dealing with a pirate like Admiral of Blood in a way that was far more potent than the Sun Brooch. As his thoughts slowly settled down, Klein entered the small port town. The place was basically filled with natives. Their skin was nearly bronze, and their black hair had slight, natural curls. Their bodies emitted a scent that was derived from prolonged contact with spices. After changing his appearance and asking about Rain's situation and if there was any news of Went's death, Klein found a secluded corner. He wiped his face with his hand, turning his face into a tall, thin Went with rather distinct facial features. He carried his suitcase and circled around the town to its border. It was then that he saw the winery run by Rain's family. The girl with flaxen-colored hair could no longer be called a young girl. She had obviously matured a lot compared to what Went remembered. She was sweeping the entrance, and there was no one around. Phew! Klein took a deep breath and slowly let it out, feeling as though he was placed in a very difficult position. As a powerful keyboard warrior, he knew about theories like method acting and experimental acting, but he lacked further understanding. He could only try to guess at Went's mood and performance in this kind of scenario. Finally, he closed his eyes and walked over. Rain looked up when she heard footsteps, finally identifying the visitor. She opened her mouth slightly and let out a half-surprised exclamation before saying with a straight face, "Why are you suddenly back?" "Remember, you're just acting." Klein revealed a smile. "I came to bid you farewell." He spoke in a local dialect, with a somewhat nondescript Bayam accent. The language of the Rorstad archipelago was also derived from ancient Faisak and belonged to another variant. As a half-historian, Klein was able to master it easily, and it only took him a short time to master it. "Farewell?" Rain asked, slightly surprised. Klein turned his head, looked to the side, and smiled. "I'm going to chase after a treasure trove, and I don't know when I'll be able to come back. When the time comes, I'll appear with a great deal of money. I'll buy a manor in the suburbs, plant some rubber trees, set up a vineyard, have my own mill, wine cellar, blacksmith shop, and let the air be filled with the scent of all kinds of spices. Then, I'll buy a few slaves and hire some servants, just like those masters. Heh, but I'll still be short of one thing." He overcame his goosebumps that were about to form on his skin, and he turned to look Rain in the eye. "I still lack a wife and a mistress for the manor. Rain, I like you. I wish to marry you. The reason I said it out loud today isn't to get an answer, but because I'm afraid that I would never have the chance to tell you again." After listening quietly, Rain suddenly scolded angrily. "Went, you're a coward." "Ah, this reaction isn't right." Klein deliberately revealed a surprised expression. Rain suppressed her voice and said, 3 years ago, 3 freaking years ago, I was already prepared to head to Bayam with you. Yet, You didn't say anything in the end. You coward. You chicken. What's the use of telling me now? You're going to see soon, and you may never come back. The more she spoke, the more agitated she became. You've said it out loud and become happy. You have no regrets, but what about me? I'll have to constantly think about you returning and live on in pain? You selfish bastard. She waved the broom in her hand and swung it towards Went. Klein knew that the real Went would have hit the broom away, hug the girl, and tell her that he wasn't going out to sea again, but he couldn't do the same. He had to pretend to be chased away pathetically, running all the way to a nearby alley. There, he hit his head against the wall while silently cursing himself. It was too fucking awkward. This is too fucking awkward. Rain went back to the door, picked up a broom, and crouched down. Her face was ashen. It was unknown what she was thinking about. Vaguely, she heard a sound, and she fell asleep. After using the charm, Klein turned around and nudged Rain, who was sitting on the ground while leaning against the wall. Then he quickly left the area, hiding in the distance to peep at the results. Rain quickly woke up and realized that she had fallen asleep without knowing it. Everything that had happened just now appeared like a dream. She remained sitting there, motionless for quite a while. Suddenly, she lowered her head and let out a sharp curse that seemed to come from the depths of her throat. Went, you selfish bastard. Sigh. Klein, who felt a tiny sensation of digesting his potion, sighed, changed his appearance, and left the place. He would have to spend the night on Saimim Island, as there were no liners headed for Bayam until the morning. Chapter 532. Lord Caucasian. After changing his face and turning into one of the two main streets, Klein went straight to the green mailbox and took out a letter he had prepared long ago from his pocket. This was a death notice he had forged as an imitation of an official police document. It was sent to the sergeant of the town of Saimim Haba. It was about the sudden death of the local resident, Went, in Bayam. When deciding to do the acting, Klein had worked out a plan to keep things on track and not cause irreparable damage to the girl, Rain. His plan was to use the slumber charm to camouflage the real acting as a dream. This way, if Rain had no love for Went, he expected her to directly reject his confession. After hearing about the other party's death, she wouldn't feel any guilt, and at most some fear. In response to this, she could effectively be placated by going to church to pray and confess. If Rain also liked Went and responded to the confession, then the dream would give Klein a chance to extricate himself from the situation. The notification of Went's death would kill Rain's expectations, and it wouldn't have too negative an impact on her future life. But even so, it's still a bit cruel. No matter what kind of woman she is, facing the situation of a guy confessing to her in her dreams after his death is definitely going to be heartbreaking. She wouldn't be able to recover for a long time. Well, if I didn't do anything, and when the news of Went's death reaches her, Rain would definitely feel very sad even if it might not be that serious. However, that knot in her heart would never be able to be mended, and she would be stuck wondering for the rest of her life whether Went had gone out on an adventure to pursue his and her future, or if he simply didn't like her. It's not a bad way to end things like this. Once she has overcome her pain, she will carry that gentleness of having been truly loved once while leading her future life. Say. Regardless, to forcibly interfere in the lives of others for acting, having an impact on an innocent person's life to a certain degree, even though I'm using the excuse of fulfilling a wish, it's not a truly kind thing to do. Just like Roselle said, the further one proceeds in the Beyonder pathway, the more twisted and evil it feels. The acting method might not be a catalyst. All I can do is try my best to minimize such effects. After sending the letter, Klein exhaled, and with a native face that didn't stand out, he walked to the only inn in town. Along the way, he summed up his previous experience, which was that disguising yourself as someone else and obtaining feedback was likely a main clause of the faceless principles. Second only to you can disguise yourself into anyone, but you are ultimately yourself. If it were any other faceless, they would have blocked out information about Went's death for the sake of this role. They would have agreed to Rain's confession and spent 1 to 2 years in a relationship with her, marry her, and have children with her, and then, to not be bound by the various relationships in this identity, remember who they were and leave coldly. If there was no exposure during this process, the potion would mostly be digested. But I really can't do it. It's just completely against my conscience. I can only try to push the envelope. Klein sighed, inexplicably afraid. He shook his head and thought in a silent self-deprecating manner, Beyonders not only have to constantly fight against threats and madness, but also fight against all kinds of evil thoughts, as well as the corruption that pulls one down and can cause one to fall if they aren't careful. Even so, at the end of the day, one might still be corrupted by the abyss, becoming a monster that one swears to get rid of. Suppressing his thoughts, Klein stepped into the inn and said to the boss behind the counter, "An ordinary room." The thin boss looked up and gave a glance, saying, "A valid ID certificate. How can a face I just came up with have one?" Klein smiled in embarrassment. "I forgot to bring it." "Then you cannot stay here. This is the rule of our town." The boss once again lowered his head and calculated his income and expenditure for the day. Klein took out a Soli note and pushed it over as if nothing had happened. The boss's eyes suddenly widened. No, put it away. I don't want to be locked up by the sergeant. Get out, you dirty bastard with no proof of identity." Klein was thrown out of the inn in shock, unable to believe that the omnipotent entity known as money had just lost its power. After a few seconds of silence, he turned into an empty alleyway, turning back into Gehrman Sparrow with stark facial features. Klein returned to the inn, tapped on the counter, and said Loanese in a Backland accent, "A room." The boss looked up and immediately put down the things in his hand. He then stood up and nodded with a smile. Okay. Do you need a room with a view of the sea, or something quieter?" He switched to a clumsy Loanese that had a thick accent that resembled that of the land of spices, with no further mention of identification. "This really is a pragmatic world." Klein silently lampooned and politely responded, "Quiet." Yes, immediately," the boss responded hurriedly. Then he called an attendant, took the keys, and led Klein personally to the second floor. "Sir, how many days will you be staying?" "It's 1 Soli 5 pence a night." Just tonight, Klein couldn't stand the enthusiasm, so he answered succinctly. At the Wind of Azure Inn, his luxurious suite with Danitz was 5 Soli a night. Without a doubt, the room the boss had chosen was clean and tidy, and there was no trace of the usual humidity in a harbor inn. Klein looked around and nodded in satisfaction. "Excellent. It's my honor," the boss flattered with obvious fear. Klein put down his luggage, rested for a while. Then he got up and went back down to the ground floor to settle his dinner. Beside the counter, tables were arranged messily on the first floor. There was a greasy layer on their surface, and a fireplace was burning in the corner, giving off light and heat. The Rørsted archipelago was slightly to the south, and the lowest temperatures in winter was only about 10 degrees Celsius. However, for the locals, this was still cold enough that they needed a fire to warm them up. Klein randomly found a seat and sat down, ordering a local specialty of grilled meat and spiced mushroom soup, with the main dish being potato bread. While he was waiting, he swept his gaze over the customers inside the restaurant. His gaze then instinctively landed on a lady. This lady had a head of simple tied-up black hair and a pair of distinctive greenish-gray eyes. Her appearance was the type that one would never get sick of easily, and the more he looked at her, the more intrigued he became. She was obviously not a native, but she was wearing a man's shirt and a thick tan jacket. By her hand was a round-brimmed hat with a depression in the middle. This was one of the more common adventurer outfits out in the sea. At her table, the 3 other men were the same, and they clearly appeared to have been exposed to the elements. Klein had never hid his appreciation of beautiful ladies, but his attention wasn't drawn to her by her appearance. The sea had a strong sense of discrimination against females. Women who could achieve a certain status among adventurers and pirates were either very scheming, very powerful, or both. They were people that one needed to be cautious and wary about. "Their boots have some fresh mud on them. Did they just come back from the forest? Haha, they really are adventurers." Klein made a preliminary judgment based on some clues. If these 4 adventurers came by ferry from Bayam, even if they had previously stepped on sewage or mud, the traces would have already dried up. Furthermore, as the town hadn't rained in the past 2 days, overall, the roads were quite clean with only some dust. Eliminating the 2 possibilities, it could only be explained that they had returned from a trip to the woods on the outskirts of the town. Klein had heard that many adventurers went deep into the primitive forests of the colonial islands in search of abandoned, forgotten pagan temples or altars, which often contained gold and jewels of ancient worship, but were later buried for various reasons in a place that no one knew of. In the bars of the islands, there was no shortage of legends that someone had managed to make a fortune overnight on an adventure into the woods. There might be evil spirits lingering in those places. It would be better to hunt pirates, or for one to at least acquire the relevant information in advance. Klein retracted his eyes and concentrated on waiting for the food. The 7 churches classified the various gods believed by the colony's primitive faiths as evil spirits, but Klein believed that some of them were natural spirits. After a while, the specialty grilled meat was served. It had been sliced into many smaller pieces and strung onto a wooden stick. The surface was smeared with a reddish-brown sauce. The fragrance was rich and the color was alluring. It looks a little like the kebabs from my previous life. In Lone, they're usually roasted as huge chunks of meat. Only after the meat is roasted would the chef slice up the meat. The method used here makes the flavors infuse the meat better. Klein picked up the wooden stick and bit down on a piece of meat. He felt the meat's juice slightly overflow, and there was a hint of sweetness in the salty fragrance. It's my type. He nodded in satisfaction. Klein enjoyed the meal and even tasted the local Gurney sap, a special beverage, like lemonade with sugar and milk. He went back to his room. Because he had been hunting the night before, he hadn't slept at all. He washed up early, put out the fireplace, and got into bed. Sleeping too early meant one problem. He would wake up in the middle of the night to pee. Klein's dream was interrupted. He opened his eyes and slowly accumulated the courage to lift his quilt. In the middle of the night, Simeon was about 8 to 9 degrees Celsius, and it was enough to make it feel sufficiently cold. After lying still for a while, Klein stretched out his arm and silently withdrew it. He contemplated for a few seconds before reaching out his hand again and picking up the sun brooch from his bedside table. Although it only provided the feeling of a hot summer on a spiritual level, and it didn't produce any actual heat, it could at least deceive himself into thinking that it wasn't cold. Klein got out of bed and headed for the washroom. He narrowed his eyes to ease the pressure on his lower abdomen. When he was done, he pulled up his pants and was about to wash his hands when his spiritual perception was triggered. Klein frowned slightly and looked up at the vent in the bathroom. Suddenly, something black and slippery dropped and hung there. It was a venomous snake extending its forked tongue. Klein was startled. He opened his mouth and shouted, "Bang!" The snake was miserably hit, and it split in half. What happened? Klein stared at it for a few seconds. Seeing no further movement, he walked out of the bathroom and pulled a gold coin from his pocket. Chapter 533. Mr. 4,200 pounds, there is danger in the inn. Klein softly chanted the divination statement, entered cogitation, and then flipped a gold coin. Clang! A faint but crisp sound echoed in the quiet room. The gold coin tumbled and fell, landing in Klein's palm. It was tails, indicating a negative response. No danger. With a frown, Klein looked around and pulled out a bottle of insect-repelling essential oil from his coat on the coat rack. He sprinkled a circle around him, then he quickly took 4 steps counterclockwise, entering the gray fog to make a divination for confirmation. In about 10 seconds, he received a revelation. There was still no danger. Returning to the real world, Klein shook his head, put the gold coin and bottle back, wore his coat, trousers, and boots before sitting at the edge of his bed, leaning back against the pillow as he placed great caution on this turn of events. He still remembered his seer principles, especially the one about divination is not all-powerful. So even if the answers he received indicated it was safe, he didn't dare to relax and return to his slumber. This isn't to say that he didn't believe in the gray fog's ability to shield him from interference, but rather that there were too many possibilities. His divination statement might not be accurate enough to cover them all, resulting in his misinterpretation. He already had a guess about what had just happened. It was that the 4 adventurers in the restaurant had indeed found the abandoned and forgotten ancient temple in the primitive forest on Simeon Island. They had obtained wealth or cultural relics, but they had also stirred the barely surviving evil spirits, causing them to be plagued by evil thoughts and curses. Time ticked by, and Klein suddenly felt a subtle spirituality fluctuation spread out from the room and quickly blend into the surrounding darkness. The hidden flow that he had barely sensed vanished, and the tranquility of the night returned. As expected. It's a result of Beyonder powers. It was solved just like that? I'll just wait a little longer. It would be dawn in an hour or two anyway. Even if there really is a problem, this place has a cathedral and a mandated punishers team. Klein half closed his eyes and began to engage in cogitation. Bayam. A Miras leaf bar. Danitz, determined to hoodwink any monitoring, carried a cup of Lanti-proof and drunkenly watched as the girls on the boxing ring danced a hot, sexy dance. Dogs hit. It's been so long since they've lost a single piece of clothing. He shouted with the other drunks. Then, ignoring whether they received any response, they laughed out loud, clinked glasses, and drank. Have you read the newspapers? A man who was fooling around in the bar late at night burped and said to his companions. Did your brain get eaten by a donkey? Do you think that I can read those twisting and turning letters of the alphabet? Holy Lord of Storms, I'm only interested in this kind of twisting and turning. Ha ha ha. His companion raised his glass and pointed at the dancers, laughing at what he thought was a humorous answer. The man who had spoken earlier smacked the back of his head. Steele is dead. He was killed by blazing. The nearby Danitz was stunned for a moment, then he sat up, turning his head slightly. He cleared his throat and took a sip of the liquor, acting as if nothing had happened, but he secretly inched closer to hear what the others had to say about the matter. The adventurer and part-time pirate who had brought him into the trade had once said that life at sea would have been meaningless without liquor, women, and boasting. Steel? What's steel? Let me tell you, when I was young, I once defeated a steel pipe. Another drunkard interrupted. What did you do to the steel pipe? Should I say something like, whoa, yours sure is thin? The first man to speak revealed a knowing smile. He didn't wait for a reply as he continued. Steel Mavati is dead. The second mate of Admiral of Blood is dead. The last half of his words came out in a low growl. It frightened one of the fellows who was already wavering to slip to the bottom of the table as he raved in horror. It wasn't me, I didn't do it. Dogs hit. A bar is always so chaotic. Hurry up and get to the point. I'm waiting for you to praise Lord Blazing. The disguised Danitz couldn't wait to smash the cup of alcohol in his hand at the group. The papers mentioned that it was jointly done by the Navy and the Church. Steele is dead. Blood Brambles is dead. Even Calm Squall is dead. John Smith and that bunch of assholes have been caught as well. A drunk who was still a little lucid came over and joined in on the conversation. No. That's not the truth. The man who raised the topic first shook his head with a smile. I have a friend working at the news agency. He told me that he has verifiable intel that cannot be published. The Navy and the Church were only used. The true murderer is Blazing Danitz and a mysterious, experienced, and powerful adventurer, a bounty hunter. Impossible. There's absolutely no way Blazing Danitz can defeat Steele. Even if it's a sneak attack, there's no way he can finish Steele. A few drinkers shared similar viewpoints. The crux is that powerful adventurer. I suspect he's an adventurer nearing the rank of a pirate admiral. The man who had started the conversation emphasized. I've no idea how Danitz got to know that guy. He contributed in the matter. Apparently, Blood Brambles was finished off by him. Didn't you notice? Blazing's bounty has increased to 4,200 pounds. That's right. Really? Blazing sure isn't simple. What a fierce pirate, no, a great pirate. Great pirates? I really couldn't tell the last time I drank with him. Pooey. You son of a bitch. When did I ever drink with you? I don't even know you. Amidst the exclamations, Danitz thought in delight. 4,200 pounds. If those fellows were to know, they would definitely get up at night to wipe the deck in envy. Ha ha ha, I can now be said to be the strongest bosun on the Golden Dream. At this moment, Danitz wished he could fly back to the ship and drink and brag with fellows like Iron Skin and Beryl, telling them all about the thrilling events in Bancy Harbor, how he had defeated the fallen bishop, how he had cleverly escaped from the ambush of Steele and the others, how he had set up a trap to finish off all his enemies, and how he would never be able to play the card game of life ever again. Unfortunately, for the sake of Captain, I still have to continue to be the servant of Gairman Sparrow, that madman. Sigh, I'm already a great 4,200-pound pirate. Danitz sighed, allowing himself to continue to be paralyzed by the alcohol. As the Storm Cathedral's bells rang, the orange sun rose in the sky. The surroundings were still so quiet that only the sound of water could be heard. Without encountering anything abnormal, Klein exhaled in relief and took off his clothes, returned to bed, and made up for his lack of sleep by sleeping for another 2 more hours. His considerable spirituality allowed him to wake up at the scheduled time of 8:30 a.m. He washed up slowly, changed his clothes, and went to the first floor to buy a loaf of bread with cooked chestnuts and a glass of Gurney sap. He ate as he walked to the dock. Since he had already bought his return tickets for the 9 o'clock liner, Klein kept watch of the time and prepared to board the ship. At that moment, he saw the lady with the greenish-gray eyes, as well as the 3 male adventurers from her team. They were buying tickets at the ticket office. The liner is about to leave. They definitely wouldn't be able to make it in time for the 9 o'clock trip. I wonder what they obtained from the abandoned temple. But last night they attracted an existence similar to an evil spirit. Please don't let anything unexpected happen when they ride on the liner. Klein used his body to block the adventurer's line of sight, took out a gold coin, and made a divination. His revelation was that the later liner wouldn't be in danger. Klein hesitated for 2 seconds, looked at the passengers waiting for the 10 o'clock liner near the ticket office, rubbed his fingers together in silence, and lit the ticket in his palm. He went back to the ticket office as if nothing had happened and bought the 10 o'clock liner ticket for 4 soldi. Then, he went to the washroom at the docks, went above the grey fog, and quickly divined his worries. He knew very well that if the results showed that there were great dangers, he wouldn't take the risk of boarding the ship. Instead, he would find a way to prevent the ship from sailing and destroy it, if necessary, to prevent any innocents from dying. If the revelation was the same as the divination from before, he would ride it normally while keeping a lookout for any accidents. In the end, he still received a negative answer. Klein was relieved and returned to the real world. He adjusted the position of the Murloc's bladder for quick access. If an accident really happened, this Beyonder ingredient would become quite important in the vast ocean. This Beyonder ingredient could also be used in a rudimentary, simple manner, just like the all-black eye which had been contaminated by the true creator. 10 o'clock sharp. Klein, in his Gairman Sparrow appearance, picked up his suitcase, followed the adventurers, and boarded the liner. Along the way, he appeared to doze off or read old newspapers and magazines on the ship, but in actual fact, he was keeping an eye on the greenish-gray-eyed lady and her companions. This wariness continued all the way to the port of Bayam, but no accidents occurred in the middle. Did they resolve all the problems? What did they actually get? Klein stopped by the side of the road, bought the latest newspaper from a newsboy, and watched the 4 adventurers from the corner of his eye until they disappeared. Phew. Klein decided to not think about it anymore. As long as it didn't endanger the overall situation, he wasn't concerned about what those people had done. He was just a little curious. He picked up his suitcase, leafing through the papers as he walked down Acid Lemon Street like an ordinary passerby. Suddenly, with a chuckle, he said to himself, "The bounty for Danitz has risen to £4,200. If things continued like this..." He suspected whether he could resist the urge of sending the fellow to the Governor-General's office. Walking back to the Wind of Azure Inn, Klein heard undulated snores that were slowly reaching a crescendo before he even took out his keys. He didn't escape? Klein was slightly surprised, but he wasn't too surprised either. He had previously tampered with Shadow Cloak, so as long as Danitz left, he could use divination methods to track him down and find the Vice Admiral Iceberg. Although he's timid, he's still cautious. Klein opened the door and entered, looking at Danitz, who awoke with a start. He grinned a little. "Congratulations, Mr. £4,200. Danitz was instantly wide awake, wanting to laugh dryly in response, but he couldn't. At this moment, he felt that his life might be in danger. Chapter 534. A dream lesson. Danitz's worries didn't come true. Klein gave him a look and went into the bedroom to rest. During the 5 hours he spent on the liner, he had always been in a highly tense state. He had also been alarmed last night and didn't sleep well as a result. At this moment, he couldn't help but feel exhausted. With a thud, Klein closed the bedroom door. Phew! He scared me to death. Danitz relaxed and slumped into the reclining chair. The scene of him turning into gold pounds had surfaced in his mind a moment ago. He found it difficult to stop having these scenes appear one after another in his mind. After a moment of silence, Danitz, who had been hanging around the bar until dawn, fell asleep again without realizing it. He dreamed that the captain had arrived to save him, but she had failed. Instead, she got caught by Gairman Sparrow and ended up becoming a maidservant for this crazy adventurer. Just as Danitz was outraged and unable to resist, he suddenly saw the blurry scene around him turn clear just as he was about to wake up. The scene froze on the luxurious suite of the Wind of Azure Inn. Knock, knock, knock. Danitz heard a slow, soothing knock on the door. Wasn't I dreaming? With this question in mind, Danitz walked over to the door and turned the handle. As the crack in the door widened, he saw a familiar figure. She was a beautiful lady, with a face shaped like a goose egg, a high nose bridge, thin lips, and a pair of pale blue eyes that resembled clear spring water. Her long brown hair parted in the middle, tied in a simple but delicate knot at the back of her head as they flowed down. She didn't wear a hat, only wearing a beige coat which was tight at the waist. Her collar was covered with palm-sized flowers woven from white lace. Matching her coat was a dark-colored skirt which reached her knees. The pleats of her skirt were connected, looking slightly fluffy. On her feet were a pair of leather boots that shared the same color as her hair. "Captain!" Danitz cried out in alarm. He hurriedly snapped out of his reverie, turned around and faced Gehrman Sparrow's bedroom while taking a defensive stance. "Be careful. Run. A lunatic is looking for you. He has a terrifying organization backing him." As the feeling of self-sacrifice welled up in him, Danitz heard his captain calmly say, "This is a dream." "Dream? Yeah, I'm dreaming. What's there to be afraid of?" Danitz glanced left and right, folded his arms, turned around, and said, "Captain, you simulated the powers of a nightmare? That can't be right. You were near Sonia Island just last week. The largest island in this region of the Sonia Sea, which was also the origin of its name. It was almost like a small continent. Originally, it was the only remaining gathering place for the elves after the cataclysm, but as time passed, this ancient Beyonder race was plagued by all sorts of factors and gradually died out. The occasional sighting of them proved that they hadn't completely gone extinct. At the end of the Fourth Epoch, the Lone Kingdom occupied this island, but in the 20-Year War, they suffered a terrible defeat, handing over Sonia Island to the Faysak Empire. That was already more than 7 centuries ago. Sonia Island was situated north-northwest of the Rørsted Archipelago, and it took nearly half a month by ship to arrive there. Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards was still in the vicinity of Sonia Island last week, so it was impossible to reach Bayam within a week, unless she could fly or use the spirit world to travel. The beautiful lady whom Danitz addressed as Captain nodded. "We have just entered the Rørsted Seas, still 1,000 nautical miles away from Bayam. In other words, she'll take another 3 to 4 days before arriving? That's what I call normal." Danitz curiously asked. "This should have already surpassed the range of a nightmare? Moreover, it far exceeds," he added inwardly. Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina entered the room and walked towards the table and chair. "It's not a nightmare power, but a secret ritualistic magic. It uses an item left behind on the ship to enter the dream of someone very far away." Listening to the captain's meticulous explanation, Danitz instantly felt as if he had returned to the Golden Dream and was beginning his lesson. "I've never heard of such ritualistic magic before. Yes, Captain has mastered many strange and rare magic and witchcraft. No one can tell how much knowledge she possesses. She seems to have mentioned that her sequence name is Mysticism Magister. Sigh, if I had known that she had this secret technique, then I wouldn't have been so frustrated over how to inform her about the unexpected events in Bayam." Danitz interrupted Edwina's description with a flurry of thoughts. "Captain, you sense that there's a problem with our point of contact over here?" "Yes, this is another secret technique." Edwina seemed inclined to describe the specific method in detail. Seeing this, Danitz hurriedly sighed. Poor old Rin and the others. Edwina stopped walking and turned her back to the window, asking succinctly, "What happened?" "I'll have to start from Demir Harbor." Danitz felt energized, as if his long-lasting depression had finally paid off at that moment. He described his attempts to recruit Gehrman Sparrow, but he ended up discovering that he was a madman, and he also exaggerated his plight on the White Agate. According to the rough draft he had prepared last night, he thoroughly described the weird and horrifying situation at Bansi Harbor, including the ambush and assassination attempt involving Steel Mavadi. He explained everything about how he joined forces with Gehrman Sparrow for a counterattack and hunt, as well as his own theories about Gehrman Sparrow's background and powers. This included creeping hunger and the secretive, powerful organization. During this process, he tried his best to restore the truth, only exaggerating the role he played, raising his status from servant or attendant to an assistant or collaborator. Vice Admiral Edwina listened quietly the entire time without interrupting him. When he was done, she nodded lightly and said, "He has no ill intentions." "Him? Gehrman Sparrow means no harm?" Danitz quickly said, "Captain, regardless, he's a dangerous fellow." "Are you sure he means no harm?" "I can't be sure," Edwina replied very calmly. "Then why were you?" Danitz took a silent breath, sensing the similarity between his captain and Gehrman Sparrow. They were people who he couldn't engage in a conversation with. Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina said with a straight face, "That's just my speculation and judgment." Danitz rubbed his temples with his right hand. "Anyway, he's dangerous. There's a secret organization backing him, and I've no idea about the situation of the organization. Captain, I don't think you should take the risk of communicating with him, even if he claims to have something to ask of you. Edwina thought for a moment before saying, "There's no need to take risks. I can communicate with him through you." Danitz first heaved a sigh of relief before asking both curiously and expectantly, "Captain, how will that work? Or should I say, what do I need to do?" Edwina raised her right hand, revealing a stand and a blackboard in her dream. "I need you to hold a ritual," she said. "It's called a soul fall ritual. It allows my soul to pass through the spirit world and attach itself to your body. I'll be able to converse directly with Gehrman Sparrow. It works on anyone below that of a demigod, with an effective distance of no more than 500 nautical miles. It involves reason and communication, and it belongs to the realm of the god of knowledge and wisdom. You must draw the corresponding symbols and magic labels. In mysticism, the blue star corresponds to the god of knowledge and wisdom. Mercury, brass, lavender, pepper, and mint are needed. Blue star corresponds to Saturday. The time of the blue star is from midnight to 1 on Friday, and 11 to 12 noon on Saturday. Edwina explained as she wrote the key points to remember on the blackboard, and Danitz instinctively sat down and assumed a listening posture. As he listened, he suddenly felt at a loss. Why do I need to attend classes even in my dreams? In the bedroom, Klein, who was sleeping, suddenly jolted awake, having vaguely sensed something. He got out of bed and listened for a moment. In the living room, although Danitz was snoring, his breathing was calmer than before. It wasn't too strange, but it was sufficiently unusual for an experienced senior expert in mysticism like Klein, who had been through a lot. He softly walked to the door that separated the bedroom from the living room, reached for the handle, and slowly turned it. Without a sound, Klein walked out of the bedroom and saw Danitz lying in a reclining chair, fast asleep. Everything around him appeared normal. Klein quietly activated his spirit vision and checked Blazing, but he didn't find anything amiss. Whether it was the color of his aura or the changes in his mood, there was nothing abnormal about him, all within a reasonable range. After watching for a while, Klein frowned and took out a silver charm. Dream charm. In the dream, Danitz was learning the soulfall ritual with a bitter expression. He had no doubt that the captain in front of him was genuine. No one can fake such a style and hobby. At that moment, he heard the sound of the lock turning. Subconsciously, Danitz looked towards the bedroom, where the crack in the door was widening, and Gehrman Sparrow, who was wearing only a white shirt, walked out expressionlessly. How did you appear here?" Danitz shot to his feet, blurting out in shock. He quickly snapped to his senses and stammered, This is my dream. How is Gehrman Sparrow appearing so easily?" With one hand in the pocket of his dark trousers, Klein walked toward the woman who had her back to the window and said in a low voice, "A charm." Then, looking directly at the woman, he asked almost with certainty, "Edwina Edwards?" "Her attire is a little strange. She doesn't look like an adventurer, much less a pirate. She looks like a woman with a decent job, someone who can support herself on her own. The style of her attire looks like it comes from Intis," Klein thought, feeling somewhat unaccustomed. Edwina nodded slightly and similarly replied with a question. "Gehrman Sparrow?" "Yes, good afternoon, ma'am." Klein smiled slightly, pressed his hand to his chest, and bowed. Edwina nodded and replied, "Good afternoon." Klein, who was maintaining his persona, stopped talking, waiting for the other side to take the initiative to ask him about his purpose. He looked at Edwina. Edwina looked at him. There was a sudden silence in the dream for several minutes. From time to time, Danitz looked to the right and to the left, having a baffling feeling that perhaps all of this might really be a dream. Chapter 535. Fond of teaching, unable to tolerate the situation, Danitz decided to do something about the situation. He coughed twice and faced Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards and said, "Captain, Mr. Gehrman Sparrow has some questions for you." Phew. Klein let out a sigh of relief. If this stare-down continued, he felt as though his persona would collapse. Edwina gently nodded her head, looked at Klein, and said, "Mr. Sparrow, have you received education?" "What kind of question is this?" Klein's expression didn't change as he indifferently replied, "University graduate." Danitz looked at Gehrman Sparrow in surprise, unable to believe the fact that this crazy adventurer and bounty hunter had actually gone to university and even graduated. He had no way of putting a university, a hallmark of wisdom, with that of Gehrman Sparrow together. Unless it's some hunter university or killer academy. Or a university that exists only in the fantasies of madmen and psychopaths? Danitz couldn't help but lampoon silently. Edwina didn't seem surprised. She continued to ask, "What languages have you mastered?" Klein resisted the urge to frown and said, "Jotun, Elvish, Dragonese, Ancient Hermes, Ancient Fasak, Loanese." Edwina responded tersely. "Do you understand the other domains in mysticism?" Feeling adrift for a moment, Klein felt like he had returned to his previous life's elementary school days. Due to his age handicap, he had been asked a series of questions by a teacher, such as how many Chinese characters he had mastered, if he had mastered the 4 arithmetic operations, whether he knew the English alphabet, and how many Tang Dynasty poems he could recite. "Calm down. You're Gehrman's sparrow now," Klein once again said without emotion. "Adept." Edwina thought for 2 seconds and then explained in an unhurried manner, "I have to combine your standard of knowledge with how I would answer the questions so that you can understand the answers more easily." This. Klein was surprised to find that the beautiful lady in front of him was nothing like an adventurer acting as a part-time pirate. She was basically a teacher with a cold expression but a kind and patient attitude. He calmed down after thinking about the vampire that headed for the Church of Mother Earth daily. "This is the first pirate admiral I'm officially meeting. She's indeed unique." Klein secretly sighed and said, "First question, where do beyonder creatures appear at sea?" "The commonly seen ones." He didn't directly ask about mermaids, as he didn't want her to see through his real purpose, which would lead to unnecessary accidents. Edwina thought for a moment and then wiped the Psolfall ritual off the blackboard. She then wrote and drew, "Set off from Sonia Island, sail 1,200 nautical miles in this direction, and you'll enter the depths of the sea which humans have never explored. There is a Naga tribe active there. They've been working hard to find the underwater city which is rumored to have a powerful demon sealed within. That's the entity of their faith." Edwina spoke in detail, partly from her own efforts to find the treasure itself, and partly from the knowledge and rumors she had exchanged. It took her a while to finish the general story, but to Klein's dismay, there were no mermaids anywhere except in the eastern waters of the Gargas archipelago. He quickly calmed his mood and said, "Second question, do you know how to remove the mental corruption from a beyonder characteristic?" He didn't hide the fact that he knew about beyonder characteristics. Edwina's eyes flickered for the first time, as though she had a new understanding of Gehrman's sparrow. She shook her head. "I don't know. However, I once imagined that it's possible by borrowing the power of an external force and completely crushing the corrupted beyonder characteristic to reduce it to the smallest specks of light. This way, whether it's corrupted or cursed, they will scatter having lost their vessel. They would rapidly or slowly vanish. As for the shattered beyonder characteristic, it will gather bit by bit due to their particular traits, eventually taking form again. Unfortunately, only gods can do this. If you get the favor of any god, you can try to please them by offering enough sacrifices and pray for a response. The law of convergence of beyonder characteristics." In his mind, Klein filled in what Edwina had purposely left out. At the same time, he couldn't help but sigh. This Vice Admiral Iceberg, captain of the Golden Dream, was extremely knowledgeable in mysticism. She wasn't worse than him, someone who had read many of Roselle's diary entries and had experienced many things. It was said that Vice Admiral Iceberg can replicate or simulate the beyonder powers of her opponents when they use them in front of her. This is rather similar to Mr. Isengard Stanton's 2-081 ring. As soon as Klein's thoughts began to wander, he forcefully reined them back, and he nodded as if he was thinking about something. "I agree with this hypothesis. Regretfully, I haven't done it in practice. It's only a conjecture." Edwina rarely used a word that described emotion. Danitz, who had been listening by the side, had a dazed look on his face. He was unable to keep up with the conversation at all. What are they talking about? What are they discussing? Why do I know every word, but know nothing when they're strung together? What's a beyonder characteristic? What does shattering it do? What does it gathering together represent? Danitz looked left and right, his eyes blank. At this point, Klein threw out the third question he had thought about. "Where can you find ancient wraiths?" He only mentioned this kind of monster because the corresponding ingredients could also be used in the domain of death. It didn't expose the secrets of his own sequence. Edwina glanced at Danitz and said, "I'll keep an eye out for you. If you want to attend Bayam's beyonder gatherings, he knows a few. He can take you there." "Not bad, it's easier to talk to smart people," Klein added, Do you know where there are people who can make mystical items out of beyonder ingredients or characteristics? I met one at a gathering, but he never showed up again, Edwina answered frankly. I have grasped the corresponding knowledge. I can simulate it, but I cannot guarantee the success rate. Heh. I'll wait then. Klein didn't harp on the topic and switched to asking, how much do you know about Death's Key? Little. An iron-black key suddenly appeared in Edwina's hand. It was about the size of a lyre. Its shape was ancient, and it had a dark luster. The pirate admiral said while half carrying the item from the shipwreck, if you mean this key, then I can tell you that it belongs to the giants. Klein glanced sideways at Danitz. Your bosun told me that it can also belong to a dragon or a demonic wolf. That was the earliest guess. I've recently found some historical documents. And with the help of the other items on the ship, I have a rudimentary idea. Edwina didn't show any agitation. She was filled with patience, but her expression remained cold. After finally regaining his sense as the owner of the dream, Danitz curiously asked, Captain, is it really the giants? Yes. Edwina gave an affirmative answer. That batch of documents showed that there were still many giants active in the fourth epoch. Some of them had switched faiths to the god of combat, while the others were left scattered, becoming the hunting targets of the humans. One of the tribes built a ship and tried to find the lost giant king's court at sea, never to return. The sunken ship we discovered, along with some of the items inside, are very similar to the relics they left behind in their original settlement, so we have sufficient reason to believe that the key belongs to the giants, and it is very likely to be pointed towards the lost giant king's court of their race before the cataclysm. Giant king's court? Little Sun said it's not far from the city of Silver. Klein didn't say a word, but he quietly listened to Vice Admiral Iceberg's description. I have to say, the city of Silver and the forsaken land of the gods are things I know that completely surpasses other beyonders. Even the seven gods can't find that place, or they find it hard to figure out the exact situation. In this aspect, I'm stronger than them. Klein thought about it with a smug and self-deprecating manner before saying in a deep voice, if I offer a sufficient price, are you willing to sell the key? Of course, unless I acquire additional clues to the giant king's court. Edwina continued to speak at a moderate pace. Very good. If the Tarot Club organizes an expedition to the giant king's court one day, I will buy this key. Klein was about to ask the last question when he suddenly remembered the four adventurers. Relying on the power of the dream charm, he conjured the lady with greenish-gray eyes, who wore a man's shirt, and her three companions. Do you know them? Edwina took a glance and said almost without thinking, Letitia Dolera, an archaeologist and adventurer. Rumor has it that she's a member from the Moses Ascetic Order or the Element Dawn. Moses Ascetic Order. The ancient organization that believes in the hidden sage. It really isn't for money, and their goal is definitely something from the abandoned temple. Klein asked casually, what do you know about Element Dawn? This mysterious organization was similar to the psychology alchemists, having been born in the recent 1 to 200 years. It combined the elements of various schools of mysticism. It had its own set of theories, and its members were all proficient in spellcasting and had mastery in many ancient witchcraft techniques. Edwina pursed her lips and said, they've always been fighting against the Moses Ascetic Order. Rumor has it that the eldest daughter of Emperor Roselle, Bernadette Gustave, established it. The Element Dawn is headed by Bernadette? Zeratl's prophecy is quite accurate after all. She can really be considered an important figure in the Beyonder world. Klein sighed inwardly, feeling somewhat enlightened. He resisted the urge to sigh and looked at Edwina. He calmly said, one last question. When the beautiful lady and blazing Danitz's attention was fully focused on him, he slowly opened his mouth. Are you interested in cooperating? What kind of cooperation? Edwina returned with a question. The smile on Klein's face became more and more exuberant. With a hint of madness in it he said, Hunt Admiral of Blood. Chapter 536. Local Faith what? Hunt Admiral of Blood? Danitz almost raised his right hand to his ear. His first reaction was that he had misheard. However, Gehrman Sparrow's smile with hidden madness and the slight movement of his captain's eyebrows, an abnormality of hers, reminded him that what was said had really happened. This madman Gehrman Sparrow really is daring. This is one of the 7 pirate admirals. They aren't people that a character like Steele Mavady can be compared with. Danitz's pupils shrank, his heart on the brink of roaring. Putting aside the fact that Admiral of Blood Seigneur's own might, just the pirates underneath him are intimidating enough. His first mate, third mate, and the captains of each ship are all capable of independently leading a large pirate crew. There are still many of the crew which Steele Mavady had brought to Bayam with him in the Blood Pirate crew. When Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos died silently like a wild dog in Backland, it was mainly because he wasn't with his pirate crew. However, Admiral of Blood Seigneur is different. He seldom leaves his flagship and rarely leaves the company of his men. Even if the focus is placed back on Seigneur's strength, it would still be extremely terrifying. He's mysterious, bizarre, and is one of the few powerhouses at the sea who is second only to the Four Kings. Even Captain might not dare to claim to be his superior. A madman's guts really does exceed my imagination. No, he doesn't know the meaning of fear at all. The death and replacement of a pirate admiral will definitely be a great shock to the Five Seas. One thought after another flashed through Danet's mind, but in the end, he strangely calmed down. It was because he recalled that Gehrman Sparrow was a powerhouse at the level of the Seven Admirals, and there might be a hidden, terrifying organization backing him. Edwina said after a few seconds of silence, "Do you know of the Rose School of Thought? Not only do I know them, I've also killed their people and taken their mystical items." Wait a minute, why do I have to describe myself as a bad guy? Klein converged his smile and said in an unperturbed manner, "I've hunted their members." Edwina fell silent again. Next to her, Danetz once again had various thoughts. What are they talking about? What's the Rose School of Thought? Where am I? Whose dream is this? After a short moment of silence, Edwina said, "After the huge battle with Vice Admiral Dusk's pirate crew, Seigneur's crew vanished. At present, no one knows where they are. One will have to wait patiently." Is this an agreement? Klein once again revealed a smile. "I do not lack patience. How can I contact you?" Edwina turned her head to look at Danetz. "He knows how." "Me? Soulfall ritual? Wait a minute, Captain. You mean I have to follow this madman, Gehrman Sparrow, during this period of time?" "No. Who knows when this fellow will go crazy?" With a start, Danetz quickly opened his mouth and said, "Captain, I've already left the Golden Dream for too long. I've missed too many lessons. I can't wait to return." He tried his hardest to show his sincerity in his eyes, filling them with a desire for knowledge. "I believe we can switch to someone else, like Iron Skin and Beryl." Before he finished his sentence, Edwina suddenly raised her right hand and pressed it against her ear. She looked slightly to the side and said without expression, "What did you say?" "I couldn't hear it." Roselle's dream spell is reaching its limits. The pirate admiral's skirt fluttered slightly as she took a step back before her figure quickly turned faint, reducing into points of fragmented light. The rest of Danetz's words were left stuck in his throat. He stretched out his right hand in an attempt to grasp something, but he ended up weakly drooping down. Roselle's dream spell? The Emperor's presence in the field of mysticism is also quite formidable. The full name of the Vice Admiral Iceberg is Edwina Edwards. Edwards. Isn't this the surname of one of the Emperor's 4 horsemen of the apocalypse? A descendant? However, from the tone of Vice Admiral Iceberg, she isn't familiar with the eldest daughter of the Emperor, Bernadette. They might not even know each other. Klein looked at Danetz, whose expression had completely collapsed, and let out a soft laugh. "Perhaps one day I will call you Mr. 10,000 pounds. Danetz straightened his back in fright. Then he saw Gehrman Sparrow's figure disappear from his dream. "If I were only Sequence 7 and had a bounty of 7 or 8,000 pounds, then I would be targeted everywhere I go." Danetz stood rooted in his dream, his head hurting the more he thought about it. In the evening, Danetz looked at Gehrman Sparrow, who was dressed as a native. "Today, we'll be visiting the location faction. We might be able to find some good things there. Heh, they have a great need for Beyonder ingredients, food, and weapons." At this point, Danetz looked Gehrman Sparrow up and down. It was rare for him to find something that he was better than him at. He said with a smile, "Their area is filled with local people. There aren't even many people with mixed blood. If there's even the slightest signs of an abnormality in their clothing, you will be discovered. Your pantaloons and brown jacket are fine, but you can't wear a shirt inside. A real native wears Taraba shirts. They're similar to Sea Soul shirts, but they're either all blue or white. They don't wear caps, headscarves, or anything. Also, people like you who look obviously Loanese will encounter very serious discrimination and hostility there, just like a wolf that sneaks into a flock of sheep. You can't hide your existence at all. Before he could finish, he saw Gammon Sparrow tilt his head and look at him. His deep facial features quickly turned soft. His fair skin was instantly stained with the color of bronze. In just a snap, he had become an undeniable native that didn't stand out in any way. After a few seconds of silence, Danitz laughed dryly as if nothing had happened. Me too. I have to disguise myself. Your disguise? Heh. Klein took off his cap and sat down. What local faction? It actually trades beyonder ingredients, food, and weapons? Ahem, to put it simply, ahem, the Resistance. Danitz suddenly wasn't sure if Gammon Sparrow had any connections with the loan officials. Klein was startled for a second. Resistance? Danitz smiled awkwardly and said, people who clamor for independence and for natives to administer their local affairs. Their encampment is deep in the woods or at sea. They cooperate with many pirates and adventurers. Of course, the ones backing them are mainly people from Faysac and Intis. Often, there will be priests from the god of combat and the eternal blazing sun secretly coming over. Bayam isn't that calm after all. After leaving the kingdom and coming to the sea, Klein finally understood what it meant by an international situation. This wasn't something that could be compared to reading about wars in East Bayam from the papers. He nodded slightly and didn't object to visiting the local faction. After leaving the Wind of Azure Inn, Klein followed Danitz, whose face was painted black. They went through the streets, heading all the way southeast. Leaving the confines of the City of Generosity, they entered a zone filled with different architectural styles. The buildings here had raised floors, propped up by wooden pilings. There were 3- or 4-story buildings that had evolved from the lone-styled terrace houses. The roads that split from each other were narrow and dirty, with many stalls on either side. They sold all kinds of headgear, earrings, and accessories made of stone. They were mostly bright red or multicolored. What a bunch of strange fellows. They especially like bright colors, just like those venomous snakes in the forest, Danitz whispered. As someone from Intis, you aren't much better either. You advocate the color of gold, and advocate a sense of luxury and exquisiteness, just like a nouveau riche. Klein lampooned. They passed by a group of dark-skinned, skinny, and shriveled natives, entering the alleys which had clothes drying over their heads. The scene before their eyes suddenly opened up, revealing a small municipal square. On the square, a group of locals was gathered around the central pond. Some were kneeling, some were prostrating, some were mumbling, and some were singing softly. They had devout expressions, but they looked numbed. As soon as they realized that someone was approaching, they quickly got up and ran into the surrounding alleys in a flurry. All the windows on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors of the surrounding houses clanged shut, and the square grew quiet. But Klein's spiritual perception told him that there were many people behind the windows, around the alleys, in the dark corners, watching these strangers who had suddenly arrived in their world. Danitz lowered his head and said in a suppressed voice, "Don't worry, this is their way of protecting themselves." Oh. Klein expressed his doubts. Danitz let out a chuckle. Before this place was completely colonized, the natives on the Rorstad archipelago always believed in sea god Calvetua. They believed that this deity who appears in the form of a gigantic sea serpent would protect all the islands here, preventing them from being devoured by earthquakes or tsunamis. Now that this belief has been outlawed, the Church of the Lord of Storms has been constantly fighting against the heretics. Even the Church of Evernight and the Church of Steam and Machinery are unable to expand their influence here, and there are only a few cathedrals. But in fact, how can the faith that has been in place for centuries, if not a millennium, be so easily eradicated? There are still plenty of believers of the sea god in Bayam, Blue Mountain Island, and the Rorstad Sea. Even if a bunch of people are captured every 1 to 2 months, a situation in which they suffer all kinds of extreme punishment, it's impossible to reverse the situation anytime soon. The Resistance's main pillar of support are the believers of the sea god. In my opinion, it will take at least another 100 years before the faith of the sea god will be completely eradicated. Of course, that's under the premise that there aren't any other disruptive elements. Sea god Calvetua. Its image is of a gigantic sea serpent. As Klein listened thoughtfully, he followed Danitz into a 4-story house on the right. He went to the top floor via a narrow staircase. Knock, knock, knock. Danitz knocked on the door to his left. "Who is it?" someone asked in a low voice. Danitz replied with a chuckle. "A friend who brings wine and barbecue." "Where from?" The person inside asked a strange question. Danitz stepped back. "At sea. Creek." The door slowly opened and Klein saw a naked arm. The arm was tattooed with a blue, hideous sea serpent. Chapter 537. Excessive spiritual perception. Behind the door was a bare-chested man with a hideous blue sea serpent tattooed on his arm and short streaks of red paint painted on the sides of his cheeks, chest, and abdomen, each group formed out of 3 streaks. Really exotic. However, aren't you afraid of being too conspicuous? Aren't you afraid of being caught by the police while you're outside? You're part of the resistance that engages in secret operations. Klein was about to retract his gaze when he was almost forced to frown by the man's thick, messy eyebrows and cold-blooded eyes. He has killed many people. Klein made a rough judgment based on his spiritual intuition. Honestly speaking, due to his previous life's identity and knowledge, he initially held a lot of sympathy for the rebels under colonial rule. However, after hearing that the man and the followers of the sea god Calvetua basically engaged in the same acts, he became even more wary and repulsed. This wasn't to say that he discriminated against the local faith, but rather, he understood that the traditional faith of all the colonial islands was still in a primitive stage that believed in sacrifice. They worshipped with food and blood, using living sacrifices, and were still in a state of complete ignorance. In addition, with the experiences of the Emperor and myself, the beyonder nature of this world is filled with madness and twistedness. A deity still in the primitive stage of sacrifice is basically unable to resist this trend. It's quite obvious what kind of style they follow. Without a word, Klein followed Danitz into the room. Edmonton, who's here? A mild voice sounded from the area near the windows. The tattooed man closed the door and said, "They've disguised themselves." At that moment, Klein had taken a good look at the situation in the room and gained a basic understanding of it. The living room wasn't very large. A cupboard, a table, and a few chairs were enough to make it look cramped. To the right were 2 doors leading to what appeared to be a bedroom. To the left was a kitchen separated by a cabinet. As for the washroom, there was no doubt that there wasn't one. When Klein went upstairs, he discovered that there was a common washroom at the corner of each flight of stairs. The stench of them not being washed for extended periods of time urged any passers-by to walk up faster. Directly in front of him was a window. 2 bamboo poles hung out and were used to hang a lot of clothes to dry. There were 4 or 5 men sitting or standing in the bedroom's doorway and the living room. All of them were dark-skinned natives with slightly curly hair. They wore dark blue taraba shirts and more or less had red paint on their bare skin. And as for the sea serpent tattoo, Klein couldn't tell if it was there or not because of the clothing. Some of them had revolvers at their waists, some carrying brownish-red hunting rifles. Some even carried gray steel backpacks and long, thick, high-pressure steam rifles. They formed a semicircle around Danitz and Klein, who had just entered the room. The person who spoke was a wheelchair-bound man in his 40s. He wore a jacket and had a blanket over his knees. He had a shaved head, a slightly green beard on both sides of his face, and his dark brown eyes were calm and collected. He glanced at his visitor and slowly smiled. Blazing. Danitz was stunned for a moment before forcing out a laugh. Kalot, you have a good eye. Dog's hit. Am I so bad at disguising myself? He roared inwardly, unwilling to accept the fact. Kalot ignored Blazing's insincere praise and instead chuckled. I heard that you killed Steel and Blood Brambles? How else would they be dead? Danitz retorted without hesitation. Kalot narrowed his eyes, slowly shifting his gaze to Klein, who had a featureless face. He knew very well that Blazing Danitz alone would have a hard time killing Blood Brambles Hendry, much less Steel Mavati. His success was rumored to be due to the help of a powerful adventurer, a seasoned bounty hunter. Is it the person beside him? When he looked into Klein's eyes, he didn't see any nervousness, worry, or vigilance. Those eyes were like a deep ocean. It could very well be. At the very least, he's stronger than Blazing. He signaled to Edmonton and the others with his eyes, secretly informing them to be on their guard. What are you doing here? Kalot didn't pursue the subject. Danitz subconsciously looked at Klein, and after seeing his nod of affirmation, he replied, Here to see what good things you have to offer. Kalot pointed to a table and said, It's all placed there. There were many strange and different items laid out, including a whistle made of bone, a simple and crude bagpipe, an iron-black leaf, and a rock stained with blood. Without waiting for Klein and Danitz to examine the items, Kalot clapped his hands and said, I have a mission. If you can complete it, you can freely choose an item from these at no additional cost. He laughed and added, By the definition of you foreigners, They aren't mystical objects, but they all have some supernatural power, but it will slowly, yes, slowly weaken until it disappears. What mission? Klein asked calmly, having no intention of hiding the fact that Danitz was only a follower. He reached into the blanket that extended to his knees and took out a stack of white paper. Find out where they are. If you can catch them directly, you will get even more. He raised his arms and began to display lifelike portraits, including a lady with greenish-gray eyes dressed in a man's shirt. Letitia Dolera. Klein recognized who the resistance was looking for at a glance. It was the female archaeologist and adventurer he had met last night and had boarded the same ship with this morning. She was suspected to be a member of the Moses Ascetic Order or the Element Dawn. Danitz looked at it closely for 2 seconds and found the picture vaguely familiar. Suddenly, he remembered where he had seen her before. Gehrman Sparrow had shown it in his dreams. He had just asked the captain about it in the afternoon, and were already bumping into something relevant in the evening. Isn't he too resourceful at gathering information? Danitz resisted his urge to glance at the crazy adventurer beside him, afraid that Kalat and Edmonton would notice something amiss. He was very experienced in this area. The resistance, who believe in the sea god, are looking for Letitia. The faith of the sea god spreads throughout the Rorstad archipelago, including Saimim. There was a snake last night. The image of the sea god is that of a gigantic sea serpent. Klein superimposed the two matters together and quickly came to a preliminary conclusion. Archaeologist Letitia and company had obtained an important item involving the sea god in the forgotten temple in the ancient forest of Saimim Island. Hence, it resulted in last night's probing and the resistance's search. Klein thought for a moment, then he gave a perfunctory reply. I'll keep an eye out. I won't randomly get myself involved in matters related to evil spirits. Of course, if it's necessary, then I will report it to the officials. He silently added a few words inwardly. Kalat nodded and said, Take a look first and see if there's anything you want. Klein walked over and was just about to inquire as he made his selection when he suddenly sensed something and subconsciously looked towards the right side of the item pile. There was a short sword made of thin bones. It was slightly longer than a forearm and had a milky white body. There were a few dark red deep stripes on it. It can trigger my spiritual perception. Klein stretched out his right hand in an attempt to pick up the sharp bone sword that was placed right at the front, to carefully examine it. The moment his fingers touched the bone sword, cries of despair and pain suddenly echoed in his mind. A thick stench of blood faintly appeared at the tip of his nose, and he seemed to see many distorted and rotten illusory figures that were covered in mucus. Klein's forehead ached, as though he had been pierced by a needle, and he subconsciously retracted his finger. A little sinister. It's not a simple item. Klein, who had experienced things far more intense before, only showed a slight change in expression. He resisted the urge to activate his spirit vision, afraid that he would see something he shouldn't. Noticing this, Kalat exchanged glances with Edmonton and said with a smile, This bone sword is capable of draining an enemy's blood. It's not bad. Do you want it? A little proactive. Klein frowned, relaxed his brows immediately, and then he said in a deep voice, No, there's nothing I want here. If Kalat hadn't asked, he was even planning on buying the bone sword and researching it above the grey fog. However, the fact that the man promoted it had left him vigilant. Thus, he rationally abandoned his original plans. Kalat crossed his hands and said, It's not expensive at all. Or would you like to look at something else? There's no need. Klein's pupils shrank suddenly as he turned and walked straight towards the door. Danitz hesitated momentarily before hurrying after him. Edmonton, who had a sea serpent tattoo on his arm, watched silently. He seemed as if he would reach out and stop them at any moment, but in the end, he didn't do anything. They were the powerful adventurers who had killed Steel Mavedi and Blood Brambles Hendry. Once out of the room, Klein stomped down the stairs without saying a word. Danitz ran after him, alarmed. Based on his take of the situation, he didn't inquire about the situation and only followed. The two quickly returned to the square, and the crowd which had gathered once again to either kneel or prostrate scattered once more. But unlike before, there was a man who had still remained kneeling on the ground, motionless. Klein didn't even glance at him as he walked past without stopping. However, Danitz had taken a subconscious look, only to discover that the man's face was as dry as a weathered rock. Pah! A piece of flesh from the man's cheek fell to the ground. It was a piece of grayish skin with facial hair attached to it. He seemed to have lost all the moisture in his body. Danitz was startled and didn't dare to look again, feeling that things had become strange and dangerous at some point. The two of them passed through the alleys, left the city, and boarded a rental carriage. The carriage driver was obviously a native, around 40 years old, and his laughter was very pleasing. But along the way, he didn't say a word. It was so quiet that it made Danitz feel like his heart was beating like a drum. Klein pursed his lips and remained silent. The rental carriage quickly arrived at the dock area. In order to change his attire, Danitz got it to stop a distance from Acid Lemon Street. After getting off the carriage, Klein didn't pay the fare or stop. He immediately took large strides and left, leaving Danitz stunned. He tossed 2 solely to the carriage driver and hurriedly chased after Gehrman Sparrow. After a few steps, he looked back and saw the driver kneeling down with a face full of zeal and devoutness. He leaned over the ground and kissed the ground where Klein had stepped. Chapter 538. Dispel What's Happening? Danitz couldn't believe what he was seeing. This didn't shock him, but it left him inexplicably terrified. It was like jumping into a bucket filled with ice when drunk, feeling a bone-piercing chill permeate his body from the soles of his feet to his head. What exactly happened? Why did things become so strange? Danitz took a breath, forcing himself to turn his head, and he chased after Gehrman Sparrow. He found the crazy adventurer walking faster and faster, to the point where he had to run with small paces to keep up. Crossing the street and through the alley, Danitz suddenly saw a greenish shadow fall from a tree. Pah! Its body was covered in scales as it twisted its slippery body and had a triangular head. It extended its scarlet forked tongue and was none other than a rather long venomous snake. Dogs hit. Why would there be snakes in this season? Danitz wasn't afraid of such creatures. He had even roasted snake meat before, but it was the abnormality of everything that left him agitated. Circling around the coiling snake, Danitz subconsciously looked left and right and found that on both sides of the gutter, in the corners of ruined houses, and on the insides of rusty water pipes, there were pairs of cold, vertical and different-colored eyes looking out. Danitz felt a chill run down his spine, as if his scalp had been pierced by a dense array of fine needles. He didn't dare to stay any longer, nor did he dare to leave. He increased his speed again and followed closely behind Gehrman Sparrow. Entering the Wind of Azure Inn, he couldn't help but look up as he walked up the wooden stairs, wanting to ask something. Suddenly, his chest tightened and his breathing stagnated. At that moment, it was as if he had dived into the bottom of the sea, being pressed down by the heavy torrents of water from every direction. Whoosh! Faintly, Danitz heard the rush of the tide and saw a faint, illusory light surround Gehrman Sparrow, as if it were forming an endless bottomless blue ocean. Within that ocean, there was an enormous azure-blue figure holding everything up. It resembled a tower. Danitz's right foot stopped in mid-air, unable to lower his foot. He wasn't unfamiliar with such feelings. Back at the last pirate convention, the King of the Five Seas, Nast, was even more imposing and terrifying than this. Almost all the pirates couldn't lift their heads, and even powerhouses at the admiral rank could only barely resist. Danitz knew very well that it wasn't a result of Gehrman Sparrow's own powers. If he was at the level of a demigod, there was no need to include the mandated punishers during his hunt of Steel Mavati. Ocean. Tide. These two terms flashed through Danitz's mind, and he immediately thought of the matter of the Resistance's faith in sea god Calvetua. Could it be that Gehrman Sparrow suffered the sea god's curse via an unknown process when he touched the bone sword? The devotee's corpse that lost all its moisture is one of the conditions for the curse's activation? When the carriage driver prostrated and kissed the ground, was it because he sensed the sea god's aura? Gehrman Sparrow would probably die here today. Should I stay far away to avoid being implicated? At the very most, I'll come back to collect his corpse. It might still be possible to save him. I can use the Soulfall ritual to seek Captain's help. She knows so many different kinds of odd secret techniques. She should be able to resolve this problem. No, Lord. The Soulfall ritual has a requirement of being within 500 nautical miles. They're still en route, and it will take at least half a day to enter that range. As he desperately tried to think of something, Danitz stopped panicking and treaded steadily into the luxurious suite with Gehrman Sparrow. Klein still remained silent, but his dark brown eyes seemed to have a rich azure-blue color that was nearing the color of black. He went straight to the bedroom and locked the door behind him. Danitz stood outside, in a dilemma on whether to flee or save the man. Inside the bedroom, Klein closed his eyes, waiting for the right opportunity. Suddenly, he took 4 steps in a counterclockwise manner, chanting a statement with each step. A wave of manic or high-pitched ravings rapidly rang in his ears as his spirit body shot up into the gray fog. Without a sound, he heard an indescribable shrill and painful howl. Klein appeared within the ancient palace, at the very end of the long mottled table. In the motionless gray fog below, an illusory, gigantic azure-blue sea serpent appeared. It was located in an ancient dark ruin, coiled around a half-collapsed pillar. Its hideous head was raised, and its bloody mouth was wide open, revealing many curved fangs that were even longer than a human's forearm. On its milky white fangs, there were layers upon layers of flowing blood and mucus. This sea serpent madly swung its tail, setting off terrifying waves and ridiculous ripples, causing the entire ruins to sway, as if it was about to collapse. The scene rapidly shattered and dimmed. Regardless of how the unimaginably large sea serpent struggled, it was unable to turn the situation around. All it could do was let out a long, painful scream in agony as it was reduced to points of light before disappearing into the gray fog. Klein sat in the high-backed chair belonging to the fool as he quietly watched everything. He didn't make any superfluous actions for a long time. The gray fog silently spread out, and the scene seemed to return to its eternally unchanging state. After nearly a minute, Klein leaned back in his chair, sighed, and said the serpent's name, Sea God Calvetua. After coming into contact with the bone sword, he had already felt the abnormality. And during his conversation with Baldi Kalot, he had keenly discovered that a tiny, weak but extremely cold and sinister energy had invaded his body at some point in time and was slowly corrupting his soul. Klein made a prompt decision and turned around to leave. He then sensed that there was a connection between the sinister power and his surroundings. It gradually strengthened and slowly connected to an unknown place. So, as he diverted attention to resist the corruption, he also controlled himself so as to not interact with his surroundings. Klein believed that as long as he responded to the abnormality on his journey back, it would only serve to intensify the corruption, to the point of making irreversible. At first, he wanted to find a nearby washroom and use the gray fog shielding and isolation to remove the cold and sinister power, but after repeated considerations, he decided to leave the area. This was because there were many followers of the sea god around, and it was extremely likely for an accident to happen. During this process, Klein grasped another point, which was that if he dispelled it ahead of time, the power projected by sea god Calvetua would leave remnants in his flesh and blood. The consequences and effects would be unknown. He had no choice but to patiently wait for the opportunity to purify himself by waiting for the cold and sinister energy to thoroughly permeate his spirit. Reflecting on everything that had happened, Klein lightly rapped the edge of the table and muttered to himself, "It's not that strong." The sea god's level was much lower than he had imagined. His original plan was to use the method that had finished off Amon's avatar to deal with the sea god Calvetua's projection, which was trying to take over his body. However, even before he had even fused with the Dark Emperor card or through his paper angel, Calvetua ended up being dispelled by the gray fog directly, without leaving a single trace. On this basis, Klein concluded that sea god Calvetua's level was inferior to blasphemer Amon, even though it was possible that the latter was more adept at intrusion, but it had only been an avatar. Was it thrown off its pedestal by the Lord of Storms? Or is it not even at the level of an angel? It's just a slightly stronger demigod that can respond to the prayers of its believers within a certain range? Klein recalled and found that sea god Calvetua was in an abnormal state. The foundational existence of this evil spirit is rather weak, as though it can collapse at any moment. Moreover, it felt like it had fused with the spirit world in the ruins it was in. And it's precisely as a result of this that it was able to escape the encirclement of the Church of Storms? Klein leaned back in his chair and made a guess. What happened today is definitely not a coincidence. It stems from archaeologist Letitia's act of taking away some important artifact in the Forgotten Temple. It caused sea god Calvetua's condition to instantly deteriorate when it was already barely surviving. It made it impossible for it to hold on to its existence. As it got its believers to track the item, it also prepared to possess another body for its survival. That bone sword should have originated from its demigod body, and it hides a bit of the power it projects. As long as the target is suitable, it will infiltrate the body of the person who touches it, corrupting the soul, and establishing the coordinates. It will then allow its spirit to be transferred over before it dissipates. But clearly, it's not adept in such matters. Yes, it's not the Snake of Mercury. It's unable to create a closed loop on itself for reincarnation. It's also not like Blasphemer Amon, who can be a parasite inside a person's soul. To really possess my body, It will directly cause its body to crumble and create a terrifying monster. According to this logical development, the dying Calvetua will likely engage in many crazy actions in the near future. Klein frowned. He didn't hesitate as he plummeted into the fog and returned to the real world. He unlocked the door, opened it, and entered the living room, startling the pacing Danitz. Danitz looked him up and down a few times and asked cautiously and warily, "Are you all right?" Klein maintained Gehrman Sparrow's persona and calmly replied, "It's settled." Settled? Danitz looked around before glancing at the bedroom, wondering if he had been hallucinating, that there wasn't any sea god curse. What did he do in the bedroom? He was lifted from the curse of the sea god in just a minute or two. Man, this guy has a huge secret. Danitz took 2 steps back and made way. Beside a table covered with a significant number of miscellaneous items, the wheelchair-bound Baldy, Kalot, wore a look of regret as he said to the tattooed man, "What a pity. Just a little more." He didn't pick it up, just touched it. Edmonton sighed as well. Kalot looked at the slightly bent-bone sword and fervently said to himself, "When an outsider picks up that holy sword, God will walk the land again." Edmonton fell to his knees as well, as though confessing to a deity. As time passed, both Kalot and Edmonton suddenly heard 2 miserable shrieks. They looked up and saw that 2 of their companions had collapsed. Their skin was like a weathered rock, having lost all the moisture in their bodies. Kalot and Edmonton glanced at each other and felt a peculiar atmosphere. Both of them stood up at the same time and looked at the table. That milky white holy sword cracked loudly, splintering into countless small pieces. Chapter 539. Late-night operations. When an outsider picks up that holy sword, God will walk the land again. But what happens if the holy sword shatters? These 2 sentences echoed in the minds of Kalot and Edmonton. The matter was completely in the gaps of their knowledge. For a few seconds, they stared at the shattered holy sword, their expressions dull while they remained speechless. They couldn't believe that the holy sword, which had only been touched by an outsider in the evening, had suddenly shattered. What does this mean? What does it represent? The 2 of them didn't dare to think too deeply about it. They felt as if they had returned to the very beginning. Back then, one of the secret bases of the resistance had been discovered by the lone military. They were raided without any warning, and this resulted in their fathers being killed in that massacre. Their female relatives were abducted and sold to different places. Before receiving the grievous news, the feelings Kalot and Edmonton felt that day mirrored what they felt today. They felt heavy, confused, expectant, and unease, all of them mixing to form an intense pressure. Return to the forest, find the high priest, and figure out the reason. Perhaps, this is the latest revelation from God. Kalot turned his wheelchair and said in a deep voice. Edmonton immediately stood up, saying to his remaining subordinates, "Continue searching for those blasphemers, but do not stay here. Also instruct the believers outside not to hold any rituals or even pray." The unexpected change in events made him extra vigilant. Bayam, in the corner of the street where the Cathedral of Waves was located. Holding a stack of white folded paper, Danitz turned his head to the side, feeling a mix of nervousness, worry, and puzzlement. "You mean that I'm to post them in different parts of the street and finally post it on the main door of the Cathedral of Waves?" He was very afraid that the door of the cathedral would suddenly open and a group of fist-brandishing priests and bishops would rush out, immediately attacking them without even asking why he had posted the poster. Klein maintained his coldness and said, "Yes." His original plan was to hand the matter of sea god Calvetua over to Mr. Hanged Man, so that he could warn the Church of Storms. However, considering that he still held the secret of Bansi Harbor, and he might even have reported the matter, it would be easy for him to arouse suspicion with another piece of important information in such a short period of time. As for the solution, it was very simple. He could post a few posters on the mandated Punisher's front door so that they could see it as soon as they came out. There was a small problem with Klein's plan. He couldn't tell which of the shops around the Cathedral of Waves was the cover identity of the mandated Punishers. All he could do was make Danitz work a little harder and stick the posters everywhere in prominent spots, including, but not limited to, the front door of the Cathedral of Waves. I should have run away earlier. Why would I think that this fellow had saved my life? Perhaps I would have been converted into gold pounds if he were any other powerful adventurer. No, who would have imagined that this lunatic would so easily resolve the sea god's curse? Fleeing might put me in an even worse state. While lamenting inwardly, Danitz unrolled the pile of white paper and casually glanced at the content. After Letitia Dolera and company entered and left the sea god's ruin in Simeem Island, they were pursued by the resistance. Meanwhile, Kalat and the resistance were trying to sell a strange bone sword that looked a little bent. Sea god Calvetua's body is on the brink of collapse with an extremely deranged mental state. Danitz froze for 2 seconds, then he subconsciously glanced at Gehrman Sparrow. I can understand the first few statements, but why is there a mention of sea god Calvetua being on the brink of collapse and in an extremely deranged mental state? How does Gehrman Sparrow know? Did he discover a problem when he was dealing with the sea god's curse? And how did he deal with the sea god's curse? The organization behind him is more powerful than I thought. Could it be that it's similar to the Aurora Order, in which they serve a real deity? The more he thought about it, the more Danitz trembled in fear. The first time he heard of the Aurora Order had originated from a robbery at sea. Back then, it was the first time he saw his captain's serious expression. After that, he was taught some so-called general knowledge of the mysterious world. Klein responded to Danitz with an emotionless gaze. In the poster, he had eliminated any subjective assumptions, and he had only described the matters that could be confirmed with certainty, so as to not interfere with the judgment of the higher-ups in the Church of Storms. Among them, the content regarding an important item that Letitia and company had taken away was excluded. The Lost Temple was changed to a broader and more inclusive sea god ruin. The base was obviously abandoned by Kalat and the others after realizing that something had happened to the sea god, so it was also left unmentioned. Danitz suddenly retracted his gaze, afraid to look any further. Captain said that the more secrets someone has, the more dangerous they are. He thought for a while and worriedly said, if we stick it on the front door of the cathedral, it will definitely garner immense attention from the Church of Storms. Will they discover that I was the one who did it? Klein gave a terse answer. Yes. Danitz forced a smile and said, then wouldn't I be in grave danger? Klein used his clown ability to control his expression and calmly replied, you are already a pirate who has a bounty for your head. Do you think you can swagger down the main streets of Bayam now? Klein lampooned inwardly. That's true. No matter what, they will still capture me and claim my bounty. No, there's something wrong with that. Danitz blurted out. But my bounty will increase. Klein looked at him, but he didn't say anything. All he did was grin a little. For a moment, Danitz thought he heard a rhetorical question. Isn't this a good thing? A good thing for a donkey to kick. With a dry chuckle, Danitz took the pile of posters and, taking advantage of the heavy winds and late night, posted them in prominent spot on the street near the Cathedral of Waves. It really looks like posting a small advertisement. Klein, who had one hand in his pocket, observed from afar and commented inwardly. He sighed and thought, it's good to have an assistant. At least, I don't have to do something that tarnishes my reputation. If I were in Tingen or Backland, if something like that had happened, the scene was too beautiful to imagine. Danitz finally reached outside the Cathedral of Waves, plastered the poster on the front door, clenched his fist, and pounded on the door. After finishing all of this, he turned around and ran, as if there were 10 mandated punishers running after him from behind. Klein didn't dare to be negligent. He pulled out a paper figurine, shook it off, and burned it to ashes before briskly walking to another street. After his recent encounters with the mandated punishers, he had a deep understanding of their style, and he didn't dare to be the slightest bit careless. It was only when they were far away from the Cathedral of Waves that they slowed down and regained their normal walking speed. Danitz had a good constitution. His face wasn't flushed nor was he panting. He was slightly puzzled and asked, why didn't you just write to the police or throw it in the Governor General's office? Before Klein could reply, he had already realized why. That's right. The lower-ranking police and the staff of the Governor General's office are locals. They might very well pity the resistance or might be clandestine believers of Sea God. As they were talking, they turned a corner and saw an extremely large red building in front of them. The inside was brightly lit and music could be heard from within. People and carriages streamed in and out the door. It didn't exude any vibes that it was late at night. We actually ended up walking here. After a second of hesitation, a smile appeared on Danitz's face, a smile that all men understood. Red Theater? Klein, who was rich in theoretical knowledge, suddenly came to a realization. Danitz laughed mischievously. This is one of the most famous places in the entire Sonia Sea. There are mysterious and flirtatious Balam girls, passionate Fainapotter girls, open and alluring Intis maidens, tall and graceful Fasak ladies, conservative and quiet lone women, gentle and docile natives. This fellow knows a lot. He comes often. Klein swept a glance at Blazing and said nothing. For some reason, Danitz felt as though he had been seen through, and he immediately laughed awkwardly. This is what pirates talk about when bragging. I've only been here a few times. I didn't have much money in the past. I could only find some average ones, and it's mainly in the area of the Fog Sea. Afterward, I joined the Golden Dream. No wonder. Although Vice Admiral Iceberg's men receive quite good employment perks and often get to share in the treasure, it's still quite difficult to save up a few houses in Bayam. Compared to the typical pirate, this guy at least knows temperance and saves his money. Klein thought in enlightenment. Danitz didn't wish to continue on the topic as he changed the topic. There are a lot of street girls in Bayam, especially there. He pointed into the distance and said, there was once a pirate who did an experiment. He randomly knocked on a family's door, produced some money, and requested to do it with the mistress once. In the end, 3 to 4 families out of the 10 agreed. TSK, if it's someone like you, who has the standard lone look, almost no one will refuse you. They might secretly hide their daughters to prevent you from discovering her. Heh. Lone's navy would commit many murders and rapes here every year. They aren't any better than the pirates, but they would only be sent back to the country and pay some small fines. Klein listened quietly, and he suddenly thought back to the evening when the believers of the sea god were praying around the pool. He thought back to their feverish and numb faces. Backlund, within the Odora family's villa. Emlyn White, who had taken the initiative to expose certain problems about himself, nervously followed Cosme underground. He once again arrived in the grey stone hall where the black iron coffin was kept. Esteemed Lord Nibs, why have you summoned me? Although Emlyn had rehearsed this scene in his mind dozens of times, he still couldn't completely remove the tension and apprehension in his heart. In this state, he suddenly understood a problem. From the viewpoint of theater studies, the role he was acting as should hide his worries and fears. There's no need for any special concealment. I did well. Emlyn was suddenly much calmer. A deep, aged voice sounded from the coffin that was covered with symbols and magic labels. To reward you. For the ancestor, you risked your life to pray to the fool. Although you didn't receive a response, you bore an enormous risk. This is an act that needs to be rewarded. Here is an acceptance draft for £7,000, a reward for you. I didn't give it to you in a timely fashion due to the great smog of Backlund, but it's never too late. At the same time, you must always be aware of yourself and not relax. If anything abnormal happens, immediately inform Cosme. He really gave me money. Emlyn almost forgot to close his mouth. Chapter 540. Suppression. Even when Emlyn White left the Odora family's underground region, he still found things surreal. He couldn't believe that he could so easily be rewarded with £7,000. The acceptance draft was light and weightless in his hand, but he felt the absurdity of reality. The hanged man's method was really effective. Instead of exposing me and punishing me, Lord Nibs gave me a generous reward. And this was done solely to feign ignorance while encouraging me to make attempts so that he can observe in secret. Are the thoughts of the sanguine that complicated as well? Emlyn sighed, his mind feeling adrift. Quickly, he stopped his thoughts from wandering and turned his attention back to the reward of £7,000. With this, I can buy that baron's remains from the hanged man and concoct it into a potion. I'll soon become a baron, sanguine baron, Lord Emlyn White. Emlyn's eyes lit up as his footsteps turned significantly brisk. Within the sanguine, if one wasn't bestowed the corresponding ritual by the elders, they would remain stuck at the same level they were at during birth. It was almost impossible to rely on time to advance. Unless one was extremely lucky. Having an ancestor of the family that was nearing the end of their lifespan such that they had no choice but to bestow their powers to a descendant through a ritual, most of Emlyn's sanguine peers would remain stuck in the concept of adulthood. There might not be any chance of them obtaining an aristocratic title for decades. Emlyn's father and mother had lived for years, but they had yet to become barons up this very day. They couldn't even see any hope of becoming one. As Emlyn walked out the door, he couldn't help but glance at the nearby Cosme Odora. This elderly sanguine who has been active in the Roselle era, has only been a baron up to this day. And I am about to reach this rank as well. One day, I will become a sanguine marquis like Lord Nibs. No, a duke, or even a prince. Only by doing so will I be able to shoulder the responsibility of being the sanguine's messiah. Yes, the baron's remains is only about £4,000, I'll have a lot of money left. I can even buy a few more dolls and give them some new clothes. Emlyn unconsciously straightened his back and began to walk more and more proudly. In the Berg household in the City of Silver, Derek lit some candles and prepared for the sacrificial ritual. The lightning frequency alternated several times before he finally found an opportunity. He was very sure that the chief wasn't be able to keep an eye on him at this moment, because he had left the City of Silver with a little boy, Jack, who had recovered somewhat, and a group of explorers, in search for the so-called route that led from the coast to the destroyed city. It didn't take long for Derek to set up everything and say Mr. Fool's honorific name in a reverent low voice. He very skillfully and methodically sacrificed the Spirit Eater's stomach pouch needed by Miss Magician, and the Beyonder ingredients designated by Mr. Hanged Man, to the ruler above the grey fog. There were many cracks on the City of Silver's solid city walls, but they were filled to the brim with black hard soil. Strands of dense weeds grew on them, swaying in the wind like human hair. All of a sudden, all of them stood up as if they wanted to capture something, but they turned limp without any strength left in them. Early morning, at the Cathedral of Waves, Alger Wilson, who had come to collect the bounty, heard an important piece of news from the diocese bishop, Chogo. Letitia Dolera of the Moses Ascetic Order had disguised herself as an archaeologist and entered the depths of the jungle on Simeem Island. It was unknown what she did that inflicted grievous injuries to sea god Calvetua, who had been in hiding for years, pushing it to the verge of collapse. As a result, it was frantically searching for an opportunity to survive. Rumor has it that this evil spirit which calls itself Sea God had been discovered by two powerful cardinals of the military a long time ago. After it was defeated by them through the use of a sealed artifact, it could only barely escape and hide. This situation has persisted for more than 100 years. Without any intrinsic changes, why would it suddenly collapse and be unable to maintain its existence? Alger frowned slightly, wondering what the difference was. A situation deliberately created by the Moses Ascetic Order? But why didn't they do so in the past 100 years? To complement one of their other plans? Between speculation and doubt, Alger suddenly became aware of an important factor. The biggest and most fundamental difference between the last 100 years and now was that the world had come to Bayam. Mr. Fool's adorer had come to the Rorsted archipelago. Does his appearance anywhere indicate that something big is about to happen or is brewing? Previously, it was the Great Smog of Backland, and there was the abnormality in Bansi Harbor. Now, there's the dying struggle of sea god Calvetua and the unknown plot of the Moses Ascetic Order. No, to be precise, wherever a major problem is brewing or about to happen, Mr. Fool's adorers will be there. They accept Mr. Fool's arrangements and pursue the activities of those secret organizations, the evil gods and angels. As soon as his train of thought changed, Alger was suddenly enlightened, feeling as though he had grasped the truth. It's not that things happen wherever the world is, but that the world and the other adorers will appear when something is about to happen. What good does this bring to Mr. Fool? Is it a plot solely to destroy the enemy's schemes, or does it help him lift his seal and release more power? Alger held back his doubts and decided to seize the opportunity to submit some intel from before. He clenched his right hand into a fist and pressed it against his left breast. He said with a look of hesitation, "Your Excellency, while pursuing the remnant forces of steel, I heard a piece of intel." "What is it?" Chogo had originally planned to send this bishop-ranked captain out into the sea to search for traces of the resistance, but he was forcibly interrupted by him. For a moment, he felt irritated. Alger recalled and said, "Someone mentioned Bansi Harbor in a conversation. They mentioned that an abnormality had happened there, but the descendants of the Medici family were well hidden and didn't end up being discovered." Bansi Harbor. Abnormality. Chogo took a step forward and pressed. "What else did they say?" "Other than mentioning that there was a fallen bishop of the church, nothing else." "Your Excellency, is the Medici family a dark family of the fourth epoch?" Alger asked deliberately. Chogo's expression sank. "That's not something you should know. I'll report it to His Eminence Cotman at once." Cotman was a Church of Storms cardinal, the Archbishop of Rorsted Sea, a high-ranking deacon of the mandated Punishers, and the true ruler of the Beyonder world in the archipelago, John Cotman. Chogo thought for a moment before asking, "Who was the person who mentioned this? What does he look like?" Alger was long prepared. "I don't know them, and they never showed up again. I remember that the person mentioning Bansi Harbor and the Medici family was an ordinary-looking young man with a thin face, a broad forehead, black eyes and black hair. He wore a monocle. He seemed to notice that I was eavesdropping, but he didn't show any anger. Instead, he smiled at me. Alger had been describing blasphemer Amon. He wanted the cardinals to believe that the exposure of the secret regarding the Medici family and Bansi Harbor was the result of a struggle between the kings of angels. This is really a suitable person to use as a reason. He wouldn't appear to defend himself, and even if he did, no one would believe it. And clearly, any divination regarding him would have zero results. If beyonder means are used to confirm my information source, there will be strong signs of interference from Mr. Fool, and they won't be able to get an accurate answer. From the looks of it, this is equivalent to what Amon did. Alger thought with considerable relief. Chogo nodded lightly. Find these people and trace the whereabouts of the resistance. Yes, Your Excellency. Alger answered with a look of piety and struck his right fist on his left breast. Dark clouds covered the sky as the rain fell down in torrents, creating white fog in the process. In the port of Bayam, the blue water rose slowly but firmly, and the freighters and liners rocked like leaves fluttering in midair. The rain continued to fall, and the sea level gradually approached the dike. The city was flooded with water in many places, and the environment was greatly suppressed. One by one, the fanatical and numb locals, in their taraba shirts and tattered jackets, came to the edge of the cliff or the dike before jumping into the sea. Their flesh and skin rapidly lost moisture as they fell, and they were already desiccated corpses by the time they fell into the sea. A group of people were rioting as they hugged a Navy sailor who was walking out of a base. They angrily bit him to death with their teeth, reducing him to a mangled bloody mess, and caused chaos on the streets. Whoosh! Boom! The dike collapsed, and the rising seawater poured into Bayam City. When Klein jolted awake, his mind was filled with the scene from his dream. For a seer, this was a very clear revelation. Sea god Calvetua has failed to find a way to survive and has completely given up, resulting in it going completely mad. It wanted to create a storm, stir up a tsunami, and drown the Rorsted archipelago so that countless can join it in death? At the same time, its devotees are starting to do extreme acts. I've already informed the Church of Storms. They'll likely be able to stop it. No, even if I didn't inform them. They'll definitely be able to sense a problem with the appearance of such a situation. They would then make the necessary response. Klein rolled to his feet, wore his clothes, and walked out of his bedroom. He saw blazing Danet standing by the window, looking out. He saw the clouds hanging low as rain poured down, as though it was endless. A sign has appeared? Klein walked over to Danetz, who was also looking out at the repressive weather. He could faintly hear the abnormal sound of the tide. In the midst of silence, the sound of explosive thunder suddenly rang out in the air. The leaden-colored clouds quickly split apart, and the falling rain lost its source. In the direction of the docks, everything returned to normal. The morning sun shone down from high up in the sky, bathing Bayam in holy light. Danetz hissed and said to himself, John Cotman changed the weather. John Cotman. The Church of Storms cardinal and high-ranking deacon of the mandated punishers? He suppressed Calvetua's powers? Klein retracted his gaze while in thought. Danetz heaved a sigh of relief. I was rather worried just now. Heh. Afraid that the sea god who's on the brink of a breakdown would create a disaster. But there's John Cotman. Seeing that Gehrman Sparrow was silent, he continued adding, at sea, even the king of the 5 seas and Queen Mystic won't be his equal. Captain said he's a Sequence 3 demigod. The potion's name is... It's... Sea King. Chapter 541. Visitor Sea King. Upon hearing the name to John Cotman's sequence, the first thing Klein thought of was the complete honorific name of the Lord of Storms. The King of the Skies, the Emperor of the Seas, the Lord of Calamity, the God of Storms. Sequence 3 is Sea King. Sequence 0 contains the elements of Sea Emperor, so it does match well. I wonder what Sequence 0 of the storm pathway is called. Klein looked out the window again and saw that, although the weather was still gloomy, the morning sun was up. The sound of the tide had retreated, and the rain had stopped. He pulled back his thoughts and analyzed the situation from the information that Danetz had revealed. The potion name is Sea King, which means that the corresponding Sequence 3 demigods, saints, have to act as a Sea King. And all acting has one premise, which is that one possesses all the powers needed. As a Sea King, he would definitely be a powerful ruler of the seas that he controls even if there's a distance limitation. He would be able to walk freely on the seabed, cause tsunamis as he wishes, raise the sea level, and control marine life. Fighting in their home ground, they're absolutely capable of suppressing all demigods of the same level. The King of the Five Seas and Queen Mystic are roughly at this level as well. It's just that there are differences in strength because of the different degrees of digestion and their grasp on their powers. But no matter what, as long as they're at sea, Sea Kings are nearly unbeatable. With the abilities displayed by the Sea King, coupled with the oceanic environment, if one hasn't seen the eternal blazing sun, true creator, and other true gods, it's not incomprehensible that people would worship him, believe in him, and pray to him. Many of the deities who received primitive worship might be at this level. They might not even be angels. Yes, don't look directly at God refers to a true deity. Previously, sea god Calvetua didn't give me such a feeling, nor did Amon's avatar. Of course, I can't be sure if the actual body of a king of angels has some kind of attribute that also doesn't allow one to look directly at them. One is a sea god who's on the verge of collapse and at most, a sequence 3, while the other is a sea king who is in good condition and is able to use sealed artifacts at any time. The outcome is obvious. John Cotman would definitely be able to suppress Calvetua's madness to prevent the sea from drowning Bayam. He would prevent the entire Blue Mountain Island and its many cities from turning into a lost sea ruin. Just wait a few more days. Calvetua's madness will completely dissipate, which will end up resolving the matter. This is the simplest and most effective way to deal with the situation, and it wouldn't bring about any panic at all. Most people here wouldn't even detect anything amiss. However, there are also some problems. Firstly, there shouldn't be any other accidents. It's a mystery what that archaeologist, Letitia, did in Saimim Island. She had single-handedly orchestrated the death of the sea god. Perhaps the forces backing her, either the Moses Ascetic Order or the Element Dawn, might take the opportunity to seek something. This is the greatest dormant danger. Yes, there should also be a high-sequence Beyonder in the Governor General's office and the military. This is a colony base the kingdom has in the Sonia Sea. Things won't turn out too bad. Then, there are the fanatical believers who will most likely become sacrifices as Calvetua becomes madder and closer to its death. They are like stalks during the harvest, falling down in bunches. However, for the Church of Storms, this isn't too bad of a development. The most pious of the heretics would die with their deity, which would save them the trouble of screening and handling them. If they aren't too pious, they wouldn't be affected too much, and it's possible to reform them. The only drawback is that the Rorstad archipelago would be lacking in manpower for a long period of time. Although such a problem is troublesome, as long as they grit their teeth, things can be resolved. Thus, the Church of Storms, Sea King John Cotman is more likely to sit back and do nothing. Phew, I wonder how many people will die in the native enclaves and slums because of this. Klein's thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a uniform set of footsteps and a roar high in the sky. Instinctively, he looked up and saw airships painted in dark blue, with several cannon muzzles and machine guns sticking out, fly past him as they headed in different directions. On the main street, soldiers in red coats, white pants, and black leather boots were lined up in neat rows. They were carrying rifles and dragging cannons as contingents of them moved past. The tense and solemn atmosphere suddenly spread. This is a colony. Klein inexplicably felt mixed feelings as he sighed to himself. I wonder how long it will take the church to get rid of that sea serpent and find the place where it's hidden. That place is definitely a treasure trove with countless precious items. Danitz, whose main job was a treasure hunter, suddenly spoke, appearing both expectant and full of regret. His attitude had changed extremely quickly. He had already reduced the sea god to a sea serpent, using it as a pronoun. The church won't do anything other than keeping the matter suppressed. They'll see Calvetua perish just from waiting for a few days. Of course, members of the Church of Storms might not have that kind of patience, especially when I've heard that John Cotman's main job is being a high-ranking deacon of the mandated Punishers. It's just that with the archipelago isolated overseas, he also works part-time as a cardinal to unify his authority. Perhaps his style of doing things is more like that of a mandated Punisher. The place where Calvetua is hiding? That ruin is almost integrated into the spirit world. Finding it wouldn't be so easy. Otherwise, it wouldn't have led such an abject existence until today. At this thought, Klein suddenly had an idea. Finding the ruin where Calvetua is hiding would be very difficult to find from the real world. Since it has already perished, it's not something that can be found in a year or so, unless more accurate information is obtained. But if the search was done from the spirit world? The spirit world would make it even harder to pinpoint its location, but it doesn't completely lack options. Snake of Mercury Will Septon had once done so with the help of his folded crane. I still have no idea how to do that exactly. But that's not important. I can ask Mr. Azek. Death's domain controls part of the authority of the spirit world. The underworld, or should I say hell, was created by Phoenix ancestor Greggrace in the spirit world. A thought flashed through Klein's mind. He took out the ancient and exquisite copper whistle, put it to his mouth, and blew into it. He believed that even if he returned to the bedroom or entered the washroom, the messenger's massive body would be discovered by Danitz, who similarly had a non-trivial spiritual perception, so he didn't avoid him. Danitz was imagining the treasures of sea god Calvetua when he suddenly felt a chill at his neck. He felt something inwardly, and he quickly activated his spirit vision before looking to the side. There he saw white bones spewing out from the floor and flying upwards, forming a giant skeleton with an illusory head that pierced through the ceiling. The skeleton slightly lowered its head. Its two pitch-black flames at its eyes were visible even through the ceiling. The oppressive feeling brought by its massive body made Danitz jump to the side. His body was half bent, and he conjured a scarlet flame in the palm of his right hand. What kind of monster is this? Danitz looked at Gehrman Sparrow in surprise, only to see him holding a copper whistle and lifting his head as he looked at the skeletal monster. Klein looked up at the huge messenger as the huge messenger looked down at him. Both parties seemed frozen in place. Tiske, I was too anxious. I summoned the messenger before I even wrote the letter. Should I make it stay here or let it return first and let it come back later? I'm Gehrman Sparrow now. Yes, Gehrman Sparrow. Klein didn't say anything. He indifferently withdrew his gaze, took his time to find a pen and paper, and he began to write the letter. He gave a general description of the matter regarding sea god Calvetua, but he concealed the fact that he had nearly been possessed and how he had to borrow the grey fog to dissipate the curse. He mixed in information about Calvetua's ruins, where it hid, when describing the dream he just had. Perhaps a solution can be produced using the spirit world, but I lack the corresponding knowledge and hope to receive your guidance. Klein folded the paper and turned to see that the messenger's hand had clenched at some point in time. He pretended not to notice anything and threw the letter up. The messenger paused for a second, then it opened its hand and caught the letter. Its body suddenly disintegrated, and its bones crumbled down, drilling into the floor. What was that? Danitz finally uttered a sound. Klein glanced at him and replied calmly, Messenger. Messenger? Danitz was stunned for a moment before understanding what he meant. Such a huge and terrifying monster is actually a messenger used for delivering letters? Indeed, there's a powerful secret organization behind Gehrman Sparrow. If I had such a messenger, everyone on the ship would envy me. It would be really, really cool. Danitz thought of how he would brag and flaunt his messenger when he returned to the ship. Putting away Azek's copper whistle, Klein got a chair and sat down, prepared to eat breakfast in a while. After a while, he heard knocking at the door. Danitz warily went over, and with the help of the peephole, he noticed that the person at the door was a middle-aged man with a boat-shaped hat. Elend? How did you find this place? Danitz asked as he opened the door. The visitor was the captain of the White Agate, just Elend. With wrinkles at the corner of his eyes, Elend looked into the room and chuckled. When you were checking into this hotel, you used Gehrman Sparrow's name for the registration. It's easy with a look. That's because this identity is quite proper and innocent. Besides, in the eyes of the Church of Storms, I belong to the military. Klein slowly stood up and said to Elend. What happened? Elend pointed outside and said, Bayam met with an accident, but it's not a big problem. The military has joined forces with the church, and they're currently conducting a search and arrest operation throughout the city. They're searching for a few powerful beyonders who are archaeologists in name. In order to find the target as soon as possible, the military has used all their resources, but it's still not enough for such a large city. Heh. They believe that although you're of unknown origin, you're very friendly to us. They hope you can help with the search and prevent any accidents from happening. The corresponding remuneration will be available after the matter. This is all thanks to you for exaggerating my degree of friendliness. That is to say, after the Church of the Goddess and the Church of Steam and Machinery, I can once again receive money from the military? For a moment, Klein felt mixed feelings. Seeing that he didn't answer immediately, Elend added, although there won't be any major problems, the earlier we find the target, the earlier we can control the corresponding disaster. And perhaps that might save a few more people. Klein fell silent for a moment before gently nodding. Okay. Chapter 542. Bayam under curfew. Seeing Gairman Sparrow put on his coat and hat and pick up his cane, Danitz recalled that he had apparently been forgotten. He coughed once and under the gaze of 2 pairs of eyes, he said, Do I need to follow? It's best not to. Who knows what would happen? Before this, we had only stopped at Bansi Harbor, but we ended up encountering a rather strange situation. Last night, I brought Gairman Sparrow to visit the Resistance's liaison and ended up being involved with the sea god's curse. Today, if I were to follow this madman to search for Letitia and the other archaeologists, then who knows what would happen? Danitz looked down and glanced down at his left arm, which was still tied with a splint. In a matter of days, he felt that he had encountered more events than he had in months or even half a year. You can stay here, but someone will be here for the sweep later. Eland laughed. Someone will sweep this area? And then the great pirate Blazing would be caught and turned into gold pounds? Danitz frowned and laughed dryly. Aside from the reward, there aren't many opportunities to earn money from the military. I'm very willing to give it a try. The only problem is that you'll have to wait a few minutes. I'll don a disguise, Mr. Captain. I don't want to put you on the spot by causing unnecessary misunderstandings. If I don't disguise myself, for a great pirate like myself to engage in operations with the military and the church, it will only result in me being captured immediately. Danitz imagined himself being pressed down, having a knee crushing his back, struggling like a catfish. After thinking for a few seconds, Ellen took out an iron-black mask from his inside pocket and tossed it over. Just put it on. I will explain the rest. Yes, there's no need to waste time on useless disguises. Klein evaluated inwardly. Without a word, he turned the handle and walked out of the room. Ellen followed close behind, and Danitz hurried to catch up with them as he grabbed his coat and put on the iron mask. When they reached the street where there was a lot of flooding but no pedestrians on the streets, Klein pressed down on his hat and asked, How do we start? Eland laughed. In regions. My Beyonder job has some special characteristics. As long as I see the person in the flesh, in a photo or a sketch, then I'll be able to firmly remember the target's appearance and obtain an additional sense on an extraordinary level. Yes, I can also detect any abnormalities and grasp indistinct traces. When put together, it allows me to do investigative sweeps in a rather effective manner. Sequence 8. Sheriff of the Arbiter Pathway. Klein nodded thoughtfully and asked as they walked, Do you have their belongings? The poster Danitz had posted last night had a portrait of Letitia attached to it. Klein had used ritualistic magic to pray to himself and produce it. No. Ellen shook his head. We have yet to learn of their previous whereabouts. The only things that we can confirm is that they didn't return from Simeem Island until around 3 p.m. yesterday. And after 2 p.m., no passenger ships left the docks. And that due to the weather this morning, only entry is permitted. In other words, Letitia and company haven't left by boat yet. Klein understood what Ellen meant. Danitz suddenly let out a sneer. That doesn't mean anything. Maybe they left Bayam yesterday afternoon and went to the other cities on the island. Blue Mountain Island was the largest island in the Rorstad archipelago. It was very large in size and had dense forests and rich mineral resources. Therefore, there were many cities on the island, and they were all built around fertile land with astonishing mineral resource reserves. For this wealth, the Lone Kingdom first bribed the indigenous princes, then forced them to use force, and finally set up the Governor-General's office. In a more efficient manner, it opened wide roads leading to cities and completed several important railways. This was in the form of establishing a corresponding railway company to sell shares and raise funds on the Backlund Stock Exchange. Of course, these large projects were accompanied by the deaths of many local people, sinister construction workplaces, excessive work, almost slave-like treatment, and a fairly modest salary, which allowed bodies to be buried one after another under the roadbed and railroad ties. To this day, a large number of locals still loathed the railway, believing that it had swallowed a large amount of human life and brought about countless suffering. It was the symbol of an evil god and devil. Ellen turned his head to glance at Danitz and said, If they leave by land, then there's nothing to worry about. Why? Danitz asked, puzzled. It's very simple. The roads that lead through the forest are controlled by the Resistance, and the majority of the Resistance are believers of the sea god. Hence, how would Letitia and the others, who were responsible for Calvetua's breakdown, dare to pass through these regions at night? If they dared to, then it can only mean one thing. They didn't realize the severity of the consequences of what they had done in the sea god ruins on Simeem Island. This also negates the conjecture that either the Moses ascetic order or Element Dawn has other motives. Klein controlled the urge to shake his head, and he followed Elend into another street. Without explaining anything, Elend took out a notice and handed it to Gehrman Sparrow. The main target is this woman. I drew this woman. Klein glanced at it before tossing it to Danitz. At this moment, they heard the intense sound of fighting coming from the side room. She has been found? Danitz asked the question Klein wanted to ask. Probably not. Elend shook his head. According to the orders, the first thing to do when discovering the target is to release red fireworks. Once it appears, everyone will close in on that location. If one encounters other wanted criminals who they cannot handle alone, they are to release orange fireworks. Surrounding teams would rush over to reinforce them. If they're ordinary pirates or criminals, we are to handle them ourselves. Let's wait. Perhaps, it's because the fireworks couldn't be released in time. While he was talking, the glass on the third story of the house facing the street shattered with a crack. A bear-like brawny man jumped down. His speed was extremely fast as he ran into the distance like a cheetah. At this moment, an enormous shadow enveloped him, and Gatling sounds came from the sky above. The brawny man's body was almost torn apart by the machine gun fire as he fell to the ground without putting up any resistance. Blood flowed out and dyed the ground red. If the residents weren't forbidden to leave their homes, then they would have screamed. At some point in time, the airship had floated over, but it didn't stop and had turned toward another direction. Goltat. Danitz recognized the victim. Seeing Gehrman Sparrow turn his head over, he forced a smile and said, "This is the leader of a pirate crew. He's from Fay Sac, with a bounty of 950 pounds. So they really are savages." He actually ran on a curfewed street, completely unaware to be on guard of attacks from above. That's right. Some pirates spent the entire night in a drunken stupor. They have no idea that even airships have been dispatched. If he had planned his escape route, then he might have been able to dodge the machine gun fire. Klein looked away and watched the monster in dark blue paint fly over the roof. When Danitz saw the pirate's outcome, he was grateful that he had followed Gehrman out. Seeing that the alert over here had been lifted, Ellen didn't linger any longer and led Klein and Danitz to the area that he was in charge of. After walking quickly for 5 or 6 minutes, they saw a barricade at the intersection in front of them. Guns were mounted and cannons were set up. Lone soldiers in red uniforms stood guard over the area in silence. On the other side of the barricade, 20 to 30 corpses lay scattered on the ground, forming a vanguard formation. Their clothes were tattered and their faces gaunt, clearly indicating that they were natives. A little further away, several young native children were hiding in the corner. They were quietly looking at them in fear. Their eyes were dark and their faces were dirty. Klein and company fell silent for a few seconds before circling around the area. Backlund. Cherwood Burrow. Furs lifted the ceramic cup from the table and felt the heat. She roused herself and quietly waited for any changes. The temperature of the hot water dropped rapidly, and a thin layer of ice appeared on the surface of the liquid. White frost appeared on the rim of the cup. I'm a trickmaster now. Furs closed her eyes in delight. She didn't waste any time after receiving the Spirit Eater's stomach pouch, immediately concocting the potion and completing the advancement. She obtained quite a number of spells with lower potency. Among them, Furs's favorites were Fog, Wind, Flash, Freezing, Electric Shock, and Tumble, which made people slip. Only at this point did she feel that she was a complete beyonder. She was no longer someone who could only pass through walls or rely solely on ritualistic magic. At almost noon, Elend, with the help of Klein and Danitz, had completed most of the investigation. Let's eat some bread and drink some water before continuing. He took off his boat-shaped hat and spoke with parched lips. Klein was about to nod when he saw an orange firework fly into the air not far away. Without hesitation, Elend put on his hat and ran in that direction. I'll go and support them. Orange means other wanted criminals that cannot be dealt with. Who could it be? Danitz said to himself with interest. He switched to a gait of raising his legs high as he proceeded forward, hoping that the battle would be over before he arrived. Then, he saw Gehrman Sparrow follow behind just Elend, leaving him alone by himself. Glancing at the dark blue monster flying in his direction, Danitz let out a hollow laugh and quickened his pace. 2 minutes later, they arrived at their destination and saw a house with a lawn facing the street. 3 or 4 military personnel were lying on the ground. Their faces were pale, and their bodies were trembling as if they had been thrown into a frozen lake. The more Klein walked in that direction, the colder it felt. It was as if he had arrived in the polar regions. Soon, he discovered that the ditches outside the house were filled with thick snow. Just then, a burst of female laughter came from inside the house at varying pitches, alternating between craziness and strangeness. Ha ha ha. Jaya ha ha ha. Ha ha ha. Jaya ha ha ha. Danitz couldn't help but stop and touch his neck, which was covered in goosebumps, with his right hand. With a clanging sound, the window opened and a charred body flew out. It landed hard on the ground, as if it were caught in an inferno. With just a glance, Klein was able to recognize through his spiritual intuition that this was one of the 3 male adventurers who had followed Letitia. Chapter 543. The reality that exceeds expectations. The target appears to have been found. Klein looked away and made a rough judgment. As there were no portraits, the dead adventurer's face was burned black, which meant that Elend clearly didn't recognize this as one of their targets. After observing the situation and listening to the creepy laughter for a few seconds, he pointed to the 3 or 4 military personnel lying outside the house. Drag them back first, then wait for the other teams to arrive before launching our attack. Or, he hesitated for a moment, then he raised his head to look at the approaching dark blue airship. Without another word, and without instructing Klein and Danitz, Elend ran to the unconscious military personnel whose faces were purple. Tap, tap, tap. The closer he got, the weaker his steps became. In the end, his body became stiff and every step he took became extremely difficult. Elend, who had been the bosun of the Imperial Navy, was experienced. He decisively stopped moving forward and turned around slowly, walking back 1 step at a time. The more he walked, the smoother it became. However, he was still shaking uncontrollably. His eyebrows and temples were covered in a thin layer of frost. A quick freezing effect that defies common sense. An extreme cold reminiscent of a disaster. With Elend's attempt, Klein was able to grasp the danger level of this area, and he could only sigh inwardly. Unfortunately, the sunbrooch isn't able to produce actual heat. It's only a stimulation of one's mind. Although it can make a body generate clear effects, it will only allow a person to withstand this cold for 3 to 4 seconds at most. Looking at Elend's chattering teeth and how he was unable to open his mouth despite wanting to say something, Klein's gaze swept over Danitz. He threw his cane and said in a low voice, "Fire! Fire!" Danitz was stunned at first, but he quickly understood Gehrman's sparrow. He had also witnessed the entire process of Elend's failure. A scarlet fireball that couldn't be considered bright formed on Danitz's right palm, and he threw it towards the flanks of the military personnel. The fireball traveled for nearly 20 meters and then landed on the ground without creating an explosive sound. Instead, it quietly rose into the air. The scarlet pillar of fire emitted sizzling sounds as it continuously shrank and quickly dimmed. Suddenly, it expanded, as if it was in a desperate struggle before it perished. Klein, wearing a black tweed coat, jumped out and landed right next to the military personnel. He bent down and reached out with both hands and grabbed the man's clothes. Then, he pushed his feet against the ground, exerted strength at his waist, and threw the man out. The military personnel immediately flew into the air, smoothly flying out before landing 10 meters away from the area, escaping the region with the coldest chill. After doing this, Klein snapped his fingers and lit a match in his pocket before the chill seeped into his body. The scarlet streams of flames gushed out like water, instantly enveloping him. By the time everything faded, Klein had disappeared from his location. Flames leaped out, flickering and extinguishing from time to time. With the help of Danitz's fireballs and his own matches, Klein constantly phased around in the extremely cold area, easily throwing out several military personnel. After 2 to 3 attempts, he carried the last member of the military back to his original position. Elend had clearly recovered as he gave a thumbs up. "I'm very glad and honored to have made the decision to ask for your help today. Captain, I like your tactful praises. Also, remember to raise the remuneration." Klein nodded politely, half-turned, and looked at the open windows of the house. He heard the laughter grow stranger. Danitz pursed his lips to the side and silently cursed Elend. "Did you not see the contribution I made? Although my fireball has become something akin to a prop for a magic show, it still made actual contributions. This guy's nickname is just Elend, but he's not just at all." As he muttered, a shadow loomed over the area, and the airship had arrived in the air opposite them. "Evacuate the people in the surrounding houses," an officer shouted from the airship. After Elend and 2 other teams cleared several nearby buildings, the airship lowered its altitude and adjusted its cannon muzzles. Boom, boom, boom. The cannons fired continuously, bombarding the house, which was still filled with creepy laughter. Hearing the explosions and seeing the flashes of flames, Klein sighed as he held his cane. This is the firepower bombardment he advocated. He had once proposed it in Tingen City but was unable to put it into practice. And today, however, the overseas colonists were producing the real scene before him. Elend and the others stood guard in different positions under the deafening sound of the cannons, so as to prevent the people or perhaps monsters inside from breaking out. Soon the house collapsed, and smoke rose from the piles of masonry. All the snow and ice was gone. Suddenly, a thick bolt of lightning flashed, openly striking the airship. Klein frowned. He saw that the airship was completely still and heard a steam boiler produce a jarring sound. The dark blue monster in the sky lost some control. Significant amounts of smoke began to billow out as it began descending to the side. Seems like they're being shielded by ammunition and being protected by an outer layer of air. I thought it would cause an explosion, blasting the airship to pieces. Klein turned his full attention back to the collapsed house. When he initially felt the extreme coldness and saw the male adventurer's charred body, he thought he had met another demoness, one who grasped the witch potion formula. Having dealt with demonesses several times, he knew that beyonders of this pathway could control ice and black flames from Sequence 7. But that flash of lightning had made him reject this judgment. He believed that Letitia was indeed a member of the Moses Ascetic Order or Element Dawn, a real woman. The moment Klein arrived at this conclusion, the pile of bricks and wood were immediately lifted away. The bright red and charred figure crawled out, with its elbows used to prop it up from the ground. She was a female and Letitia's original appearance could barely be recognized. This made Elend and the others shocked to discover that they had already found their target. However, compared to before, Letitia's current state was both terrifying and miserable. Her body was covered in black spots. The artillery shells had torn open red holes that lined her body. White fascia that seemed to have a life of its own was squirming inside her body. The top of her head had split open, and her brain came oozing out, sticking to the surface like the palms of children overlapping each other. Her gray eyes were out of focus, one of them blazing with fire, the other flashing with lightning. 2 heads that were screaming in pain were embedded at her abdomen below her chest. They were the other 2 male adventurers. Not only has she lost control, but she also appears to be corrupted. She was already severely injured from the previous bombardment, and her aura had dropped to an extreme level. Klein didn't take action and instead watched as the Beyonders from the military began to attack. Psychic piercing, whip of pain, purifying bullets, and small-caliber gunfire were launched. With this series of attacks, Rampager Letitia, who only had enough time to crack the ground and spread the crack outwards, completely broke down and became a dismembered corpse. Pah! Her torso fell to the ground, and the heads of the 2 male adventurers rolled out. Klein's eyes slightly narrowed. He discovered that there was a yellowish-brown book hidden within the flesh and blood of Letitia's abdomen. On the surface of the book, there was a line of words written in Elven. Book of Calamity. Why do these books and notebooks always find themselves in the stomachs of people? It's the same as the Antigonus family's notebook last time. Klein lampooned. Then he suspected that the Book of Calamity was the item that the fake archaeologist Letitia had taken from the ruins of the sea god. At this moment, some military personnel grabbed the 2 male adventurers' heads who still seemed capable of speaking and hurriedly asked, "What did you do in the ruin of the sea god?" "Sea god's ruins," one of the male adventurers answered with pain and confusion. "We haven't been there." He tried to move his eyes, to check the situation below his neck. "The sea god ruin in Simeem Island," the military personnel reminded him. "No, we didn't." The male adventurer wanted to shake his head, but he couldn't do so. "We went to an ancient elven ruin. Letitia found a book there. She liked it very much. She quickly began to study it, then as she went mad. She's crazy." As the male adventurer shouted out, whatever was left of his mind completely dissipated. "It's not a lost temple of the sea god but a ruin of the ancient elves? This is different from what I imagined." Klein was about to listen carefully when Elend came over and politely asked him and Danitz to distance themselves from the interrogation. Turning into another street, Klein slowed down and thought about the whole thing. Why would Letitia's act of taking the Book of Calamity out of the ancient elven ruins cause sea god Calvetua to be no longer capable of maintaining its existence, slowly bringing it to the point of breakdown? What's the connection between the two? Elves. Sea god. According to Little Sun, the ancient god, Elf King Sanayathrim, wielded the present authorities of the Lord of Storms. That is to say, the elves no doubt possess Sequence 3 Sea King, or an even higher Sequence 2. Could it be that it was by chance that this sea serpent, Calvetua, discovered a ruin of the elves at the bottom of the sea, directly devoured the beyonder characteristics left behind by a certain high elf, and was lucky enough to survive the two possibilities of death and losing control? As such, it succeeded in acquiring the rank of a demigod and gradually gained the faith of the Rorstad Archipelago's natives? Klein slowly came to a realization, and he had to thank Mr. Hanged Man for this. Initially, Little Sun didn't reveal the corresponding authorities of the 8 ancient gods, but later, under the guidance of the Hanged Man, he explained some things, including the Elf King Sanayathrim general situation. As for devouring beyonder characteristics or the corresponding ingredients to advance, it wasn't something that didn't happen. Before the potion system was fully constructed, the human ancestors had made similar attempts to obtain beyonder powers. However, only a very small group of extremely fortunate people had managed to survive to become beyonders without becoming monsters, lunatics, or dying on the spot, with their flesh and blood falling apart. Such an attempt had a 1 in 1,000 chance of success, or even a 1 in 10,000 chance. After the potion system was established, no one was willing to take such a great risk. If that's the case, then Calvetua was indeed very lucky back then. Of course, there's also the factor of its strong physique. However, its intelligence didn't seem to increase much, only being capable of deceiving its believers. It didn't actually find any traces of the elven ruins on Simeem Island, and how it's closely related to the one it's hiding in. After Letitia and company took the Book of Calamity, that ruin collapsed, causing Calvetua's hiding spot to experience abnormalities, resulting in the barely surviving Calvetua to be unable to hold out any longer? This can explain how Letitia and company managed to easily succeed. There aren't any members of the Resistance or the Sea God's followers defending the area. Only when something happened did Calvetua discover the problem and realize the connection between the two ruins. With what he just gathered, Klein tried to explain what he had been wondering about the whole time. This included why the dying sea god Calvetua didn't allow its followers to become carriers. It would have reduced most of the accidents and made things easier. With the brutality Calvetua displayed, it was only right that it made such a choice. The answer Klein arrived at was that the body Calvetua wanted to corrupt and possess had to have a certain amount of elven blood, and that was the only way to survive the transfer of beyonder characteristics up to a certain level. However, when Klein touched it, due to the grey fog and his uniqueness, it allowed Calvetua to instantly find a better target. Chapter 544. Expert Klein had just sorted out his thoughts when Elend caught up with the two and said with a smile, "We've found the target. The investigation is over. I'll bring you back to the hotel first, and I'll bring the remuneration in 2 days. Also, it's best if you don't go out today." Klein maintained Gehrman Sparrow's character by only nodding slightly without giving any verbal response. On the way back to the Wind of Azure Inn, Danitz clearly had some doubts or wistful thoughts on his mind, but due to the presence of Elend, who was part of the military, he could only change the subject and discuss with great interest about which pirates would end up being caught in the city's thorough sweep today. To him, they weren't friends as long as those guys didn't belong to the Golden Dream. They weren't worth sympathizing with. After entering the hotel room and watching Elend leave, he closed the door and said while clicking his tongue, "The Book of Calamity. Ancient Elven Ruins. This really is an interesting matter, but how did the elves end up like devils? Just by casually taking their book, a casual flip through it had caused that woman to go insane and lose control. What kind of image do you have of elves? Living in the mountains and seas, specializing in cooking, creatures who enjoy nature? According to Little Sun, the 8 ancient gods before the cataclysm were all very tyrannical, very cruel, and very evil. Among them was the elf king Sanayathrim, and the elves who believed in him and viewed him as their king couldn't have been any better. One can make a comparison with the members of the Aurora Order. The Beyonder races left behind by the Dark Epoch basically can't be associated with the good alignment that normal people have in mind. Klein replied in his mind. Of course, he didn't rule out the possibility that after the ancient gods' fall, the dragons, giants, elves, sanguine, and other living creatures would gradually extricate themselves from the negative effects and become more normal. However, This was only limited to the middle and lower levels, and it didn't include the demigod powerhouses. And the high elf that left behind the Book of Calamity was clearly the latter. With a thought, Klein suddenly realized something. Danitz understands Elvish. He recognized the title of the ancient goatskin book as the Book of Calamity. Vice Admiral Iceberg has actually taught her crew to such an extent. Not only does it include ancient Fey Sac, but she has also taught them Elvish, which can stir up the powers of nature. Perhaps Jotun and ancient Hermes are all part of the curriculum on the Golden Dream. They really are a bunch of pirates with knowledge and dreams. However, Ma'am Captain, aren't you being a little overboard on certain subjects? Danitz is lacking in so many other aspects. That's right. The most important thing for a pirate whose main job is to be a treasure hunter has to be mastering the ancient languages. Klein ignored Danitz's comments and looked out the window. The sky remained gloomy, as if a heavy rain would fall at any time. It made one involuntarily feel suppressed. Klein nodded slightly, feeling slightly relaxed as he thought. Letitia has been found. Being aware of the ancient elven ruin on Simeem Island, the Church of Storms and the kingdom's military will likely use its connection to the place where Calvetua is hiding, to find the sea god that is becoming progressively crazier. Or they might use the ruin to speed up its collapse. That way, apart from the most fervent and pious sea god believers dying, the rest basically won't suffer any harm. Klein had originally thought of using the spirit world to locate sea god Calvetua's hiding spot after it died before the official Beyonders did. He could then infiltrate it, taking the treasure with him. But even before the plan had begun, the appearance of the Book of Calamity pushed his plan to the verge of failure. Phew. It's fine. It only existed in my imagination, and it never belonged to me. It's fine if I don't get it. I don't even know what I'll get. Letting this matter get resolved this way is for the best. Klein withdrew his gaze from the weather. His mood calm and relaxed. He just inevitably felt a slight sense of loss. That day, he and Danitz followed Ellen's advice and didn't head out again. They only remained in the inn. In Bayam City, there would be the sound of gunfire and explosions from time to time. This continued until the sky turned dark. The next morning, Klein got up on time and found that there were layers of clouds in the sky and the sky remained dark. This meant that the confrontation between the Church of Storms Cardinal, high-ranking deacon of the mandated Punishers, John Cotman, and sea god Calvetua was still ongoing. Klein felt pain in his stomach and prepared to head to the washroom with the newspapers. However, he gave up on that idea when he saw Danitz leisurely reading a newspaper while lying in a reclining chair, munching on a piece of white bread in his mouth. Reading the newspaper while on a toilet doesn't match Gehrman Sparrow's persona. Although it would be boring, I mustn't slack off on acting. Sigh, I've once again found a difference in the behavior between my true self and my disguised identity. Klein summed it up in silence and went into the washroom. He took off his pants and sat down on the toilet, staring almost in a daze at the pale white wall in front of him, as if he could read words from it. At this moment, his spiritual perception was triggered. He hurriedly tapped his molars and activated his spirit vision. Two thick, long white bones appeared in front of him. They were the messenger's legs. The messenger stood there, its head passing through the ceiling, but its black flames in its eye sockets could still be seen. It lowered its head slightly and looked down at Klein, who was sitting on the toilet. Klein looked up, stunned for 2 seconds, his mind filled with a baffling thought. Should I act like a woman, hurriedly covering my nether regions, or should I just be open and fearless? Before he could make up his mind, the messenger dropped the letter, disintegrated into a pile of bones, and disappeared into the floor. It took a moment for Klein to react before he caught Mr. Azek's reply. This messenger is being more and more impolite. Can't you see that I'm using the toilet? Don't you know to knock on the door or to squeeze it through the crack under the door? Klein cursed in anger and amusement. After giving it some more thought, he felt that it would be putting the messenger in a tough spot to pass the letter through the crack in the door. The 4-meter-tall giant had to lie down in order to reach that position. Just thinking about it is rather funny. Well, the next time I write a letter, I'll add a paragraph so that Mr. Azek can educate the messenger so that he will be more polite. Klein unfurled the letter and read Azek's reply. According to the knowledge I've recalled, I can provide you with 2 methods. The first requires certain prerequisites. If a unique item belonging to you or someone else is located where sea god Calvetua is, you can use divination to easily locate its position. The other prerequisite is that you can enter the spirit world. I have plenty of methods for this. I'll list the most common 3. The second method is to use a secret deed ritual and pray to Red Light Ayr Moria. He represents authority and will. At a certain level, he grasps the relevant knowledge of the creatures in the spirit world and the locations in the spirit world. So Red Light of the 7 pure lights is named Ayr Moria. The principle of a secret deed ritual is to adjust one's state, release one's mind and body, and align oneself with the target of the prayer bit by bit. Finally, an overlapping will occur, allowing one to acquire the corresponding knowledge. And this kind of alignment and overlapping is relative. While acquiring knowledge, my secrets will also be open to the target of the prayer. I can't trust Red Light. I have too many secrets. Klein's first reaction was to rule out the second approach. As for the first solution, there was also the chance of failure. Klein didn't have any unique items located where Sea God Calvetua hid itself. Either I use the help of the resistance and send something to Calvetua, or I'll have to find the original owner of an item sacrificed to Sea God from its believer. Furthermore, it has to be unique. Send something to Calvetua. As he thought, Klein suddenly had an idea. He braced himself and considered it over and over again, thinking that there was a certain probability of success. After finishing his deed in the washroom, Klein washed his hands, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and went above the gray fog. He planned on attempting divination and received a revelation that there was danger, but it was manageable as long as it was handled properly. With all of this done, he returned to the living room and walked towards the reclining chair. Danitz immediately sat up and said with a dry laugh, "Is there something? Do you know the words to the prayer relating to the sea god?" Klein asked with an unperturbed tone. Danitz spread out his hands and suddenly hissed. "Dog's hit." He softly cursed his injured arm and switched to smiling. "Yes. I've seen a few members of the resistance hold rituals. The details are, adorer of the sea and spirit world, guardian of the Rorstad archipelago, ruler of the undersea creatures, master of tsunamis and storms, the great Calvetua. By the way, the 2 instances that it was effective were recited in Elvish. Adorer of the sea and spirit world. Its bearing is very low. It's not the same as my honorific name. That's true. I created it by copying it from the 7 true gods." Klein nodded gently and said, "Do you know where there are empty warehouses and abandoned houses?" "Of course. Every great pirate knows a few," Danitz replied without hesitation. Klein turned around and walked towards the coat rack. "Take me there." "To do what?" Although Danitz was puzzled, he didn't dare ask. In the dock area, in a dirty and dilapidated warehouse, Danitz watched Gehrman Sparrow take out 3 candles and several metal bottles. Unable to hold back his curiosity any longer, he asked, What are you planning on doing?" Klein didn't look back and replied very calmly, "Sacrifice." "To whom?" Danitz pressed with interest. Klein set up the altar, took out an iron cigar case and calmly said, "Calvetua." His plan was to give something directly to sea god Calvetua. As long as Calvetua accepted it, he could use divination and other methods to find its hiding place. As for whether or not Calvetua would accept it, he had certainly considered it, believing that it was a definite possibility. As Calvetua was currently on the verge of death, it was in a state of extreme madness, with little sense of reason. It acted on instinct alone, and it might have a strong desire for the aura of the gray fog. Therefore, Klein was prepared to sacrifice an iron cigar case that was often placed above the gray fog. He wanted to see if Calvetua would accept it or not, and if he didn't, he wouldn't suffer any losses. He could then pretend as though nothing had happened. Sacrifice to sea god Calvetua? At that moment, Danitz found his brain lacking. He couldn't comprehend what was on Gehrman Sparrow's mind. "Are you crazy? How could it accept your sacrifice? Even if it's accepted, what would be the point? It's dying. And it's very dangerous." Danitz blurted out. Immediately, he added inwardly, "No, Gehrman Sparrow isn't crazy, because he has always been crazy." Klein glanced at him and simply said, "In this domain, I'm an expert. When it comes to sacrificial rituals, I'm an expert." Klein wasn't modest about this. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.